In the year 1273, in a prosperous market town of the Midlands, a young apprentice named Thomas learns the ancient craft of proclamation, how to carry the town's announcements with clarity and grace. Tonight, we will follow him through the quiet hours of preparation, the gentle mastery of his trade, and the peaceful satisfaction of work done well. Good evening and welcome. I am glad you are here. Our story tonight takes us to the Herald's modest rooms above the market square, where Thomas tends to the careful preparation of his announcements with an unhurried rhythm that invites the mind to slow, the body to rest. There is no destination to rush toward, no puzzle to solve, only the quiet comfort of a story told slowly, with care. Thomas, 19 years old, sat at the worn wooden table in the dim candlelight, his long-fingered hands steady as they arranged parchment before him. The scent of beeswax candles and aged leather filled the small room, a perfume he had come to love during his 3 years of apprenticeship. Outside, the market square lay silent beneath the stars, the cobblestones still holding the warmth of the autumn day. His dark hair, still damp from washing, fell across his forehead as he leaned forward to study the careful lettering he had practiced that afternoon. The room itself was a sanctuary of quiet order. Shelves lined with rolled proclamations stretched along one wall, each one tied with ribbon and labeled in careful script. A small hearth glowed with banked coals, releasing a gentle warmth that made the space feel like an embrace. The table where Thomas worked was polished smooth by years of use, its surface familiar beneath his palms. He knew every grain of the wood, every slight depression where previous apprentices had pressed their tools. His master, Master Edmund, had occupied this same table for 30 years, and Thomas found comfort in that continuity. Edmund himself was asleep in the chamber beyond, a sturdy man of 56 years old, with silver-streaked brown hair and hands gnarled from decades of careful work. Each evening, Edmund would review Thomas's practice, offering observations in his quiet way, never harsh, always patient. Tonight, Thomas was reviewing his own work before presenting it, a habit Edmund had encouraged from the beginning. The candle burned steadily, casting a pool of warm light across the parchment. The announcement for tomorrow was a simple one, but Thomas understood that simplicity required the most attention. A new baker was opening his shop, and the townsfolk deserved to hear of it with clarity and warmth. Not rushed, not dramatic, simply clear and honest. Thomas had written the words in his head 100 times, hearing them as they would sound when spoken aloud. The herald's voice was an instrument Edmund had taught him, and it must be tuned with the same care a lute maker gave to his craft. As Thomas reviewed the lettering once more, his fingers traced the shapes almost without thinking. This was the meditative part of his work, the part that quieted his mind completely. Each letter connected to the next in a sequence his hands had learned so thoroughly that his thoughts could wander elsewhere. To the baker's kind face, to the smell of fresh bread that would soon fill that small shop, to the way the announcement would carry across the square in the morning light. The candle flickered gently, and Thomas became aware of the ambient sounds around him. In the distance, the monastery bells chimed once, a single note that seemed to travel across the rooftops and fade into the night. Closer, from the street below, came the faint sound of footsteps, the night watchman making his rounds, his pace steady and unhurried. These sounds were the rhythm of the town, the heartbeat that Edmund had taught him to recognize and respect. They were the true audience for any proclamation, not the words themselves, but the way those words moved through this living, breathing community. Thomas set down his practice parchment and allowed himself a moment of stillness. His shoulders, which he had not realized were tense, relaxed into the chair's worn back. The leather creaked softly, a sound so familiar it barely registered. He thought of tomorrow morning when he would stand at the center of the market square with the sun rising behind the church tower. He would plant his feet on the cobblestones his father had helped lay 5 years ago, would breathe in the morning air, and would speak the baker's good news to the gathered people. His voice would not strain or hurry. It would simply be present, clear as a bell. This was the work Edmund had taught him, not to seek attention, but to be worthy of the attention given. Not to impress, but to serve. The distinction had seemed subtle when Thomas first arrived as an uncertain boy, but over 3 years it had become the foundation of everything. He understood now that a herald was a kind of bridge between the authority that needed to speak and the people who needed to hear. A good herald was like a skilled mason, creating the path but never calling attention to his own stones. The small window beside the table showed only darkness now, the square beyond invisible. But Thomas could imagine it, the sleeping shutters of the shops, the fountain at its center catching moonlight, the alley leading toward the river where willows draped their branches like patient, sleeping guardians. This town was his landscape now, as familiar as his own hands. Every corner held a memory of an announcement made, a proclamation learned, a moment of connection between the herald's voice and the listening ears of his community. Edmund's door creaked slightly, and Thomas heard the familiar sound of his master turning in his sleep. It was a good sound, the evidence of rest earned through honest work. Edmund had told him that a herald who did not sleep well was a herald who had worked carelessly, for a clear conscience was the best pillow. Thomas resolved that, when he finally climbed the narrow stairs to his own small room, he would sleep as deeply as his master did now. He gathered the parchments carefully, rolling them with the same deliberate care he gave to everything. The ribbon, a soft blue, the color of the town, wrapped around each scroll, tying off with a small knot that Edmund had taught him to make with a single motion. 3 years of practicing, and the motion had become automatic, his fingers knowing the way without his mind needing to direct them. This was mastery of a kind, though Edmund would have laughed at calling it that. It was simply the work, done until the body remembered it as naturally as breathing. The candle had burned lower, the light now concentrating in a smaller circle on the table. Thomas knew he had perhaps 30 minutes of good light remaining, and he used them to tidy his workspace. The ink bottle was sealed and set in its proper place. Pens were cleaned and laid in their holders. Dust from the day's practice was brushed away with a soft cloth. Each action was accompanied by a small breath of satisfaction, not pride exactly, but the simple contentment of returning order to the space where he worked. When everything was arranged properly, Thomas extinguished the candle with a pinch, breathing out the small wisp of smoke that rose from the wick. The darkness that followed was complete but not frightening. He knew this room so well that he could navigate it in darkness if he needed to. His hands found the chair's back. His feet found the path toward Edmund's door, and he made his way quietly through the small chamber beyond, where his master slept undisturbed. The stairs to the upper floor were narrow and worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Thomas climbed them slowly, his hand trailing along the wall, feeling the slight variations in the plaster. There was comfort in this slowness, in this attention to each small movement. By the time he reached his own room, his mind had settled into a state of perfect calm. The work of the day was complete. Tomorrow's work was prepared. There was nothing more to be done or thought about. His small chamber held the basic comforts: a narrow bed with a wool blanket, a small shelf with his few possessions, a window that looked out toward the rooftops. The night air coming through the window was cool and carried the scent of wood smoke from distant hearths. Thomas removed his tunic and lay down beneath the blanket, feeling its weight settle across him like a reassuring hand. The sounds of the sleeping town filtered through the window, a dog barking distantly, the river's distant murmur, the soft creaking of buildings settling into night. These sounds were like a lullaby, the town's quiet song sung to all those within it. Thomas thought of the baker, probably sleeping soundly tonight, unaware of the announcement that would soon carry his news across the market square. He thought of the people who would gather tomorrow morning, their ears opening to the proclamation, their faces lifting toward the herald's voice. And then, without quite realizing the transition, Thomas was no longer thinking of these things. His mind had drifted beyond thoughts entirely, into that place beyond consciousness where rest begins. The weight of the blanket, the cool night air, the familiar sounds of the sleeping town, all of these carried him gently toward sleep, toward the restoration that would prepare him for the quiet work of tomorrow. The morning arrived as mornings do in autumn, gradually, without announcement, though Thomas had learned that mornings were perhaps the most important announcements of all. He woke before the bells, a habit formed through 3 years of dawn preparations, his body knowing the rhythm of the town as intimately as his mind knew the words he would speak. The chamber was still dim, but not dark. That particular quality of light that exists only in the hour before sunrise had begun to filter through the small window, painting everything in tones of silver and deep blue. Thomas lay for a moment, feeling the blanket's weight, listening to the particular silence of the very early morning, a silence different from night's silence, fuller somehow, pregnant with the day about to begin. He rose and moved to the window, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The market square below was empty, the cobblestones still wet with dew. The fountain stood in its center like a sleeping giant, its basin catching the pale light. Beyond, the baker's shop, still dark inside but ready. Everything was ready. The announcement rested on the table below, waiting to be carried. Thomas could almost feel it, the weight of those words, the responsibility and privilege of being the voice through which the town would learn this news. The washing basin held water from the night before, cool enough to make him gasp slightly as he splashed his face and neck. The shock of cold was pleasant, waking him fully, clearing the last threads of sleep from his mind. He dried himself with a linen cloth and dressed in his proclamation clothes, a tunic of deep blue wool, the same color as the ribbon that bound the announcement. Edmund had taught him that a herald's appearance was part of the proclamation itself. Before he spoke a word, his clothing announced that something important was being said. The town's people had learned to recognize that blue from across the square. Downstairs, Edmund was already awake, moving about the small kitchen with the unhurried grace of someone beginning a familiar routine. The older man, 56 years old, with his silver-streaked brown hair caught back with a simple cord, was heating water for the morning tea. The scent of herbs, dried mint and chamomile, rose with the steam, filling the small space with comfort and wakefulness. "You slept well," Edmund observed, not as a question but as a statement of fact. He had a way of knowing such things, reading the state of rest in a person's bearing the way other men read written words. "Yes, master," Thomas replied. "The work was ready." Edmund nodded, setting out 2 cups on the table. He moved with the ease of someone whose body remembered every motion it had ever made, economical and certain. "The baker sent word yesterday. He's anxious. First business of his own." Edmund poured the hot water and the herbs unfurled, releasing their full fragrance into the air. His father was a baker before him and his grandfather. 3 generations of bread, and now he stands on his own threshold. Thomas accepted the cup Edmund offered, feeling its warmth against his palms. "Will many come to hear?" "Those who bake know the value of knowing who bakes," Edmund said, settling into his chair with the kind of deliberation that suggested sitting down was itself a craft to be practiced. "The women who make their households bread will come. Those who buy bread will come. And those who simply enjoy the excuse to gather in the square before the day's work begins will come. This is how a community learns itself, through the small announcements, the ordinary things made worth hearing because a voice carries them across the square." They drank their tea in companionable silence. Outside, the light continued its gradual brightening. The distant sound of someone drawing water from the well reached them, a rope's creak and the splash of a bucket. Life was beginning, the town stirring like a creature waking from sleep. But here, in Edmund's kitchen, there was still this pocket of quiet, this moment before the work began. "Your voice is ready," Edmund said finally. It was not a compliment exactly, but an observation, the kind of thing he might say about a tool that had been properly maintained. "I heard you practicing yesterday. The proclamation sits well in your mouth." Thomas felt a small warmth expand in his chest at this, not pride exactly, but the satisfaction of having done something correctly, of being recognized as having done it so. "I imagined the baker's face when he heard it," he said. "I wanted the words to carry that, the sense that this is a good thing happening." Edmund set down his cup with the same careful deliberation he gave to all his movements. "That is the herald's true work," he said. "Not the words themselves, but what lives in the words. The baker could have written his announcement on a board and nailed it to his shop, but he came to us because he wanted the news to be carried with intention, with recognition of its importance. You must feel that weight, Thomas, not as a burden but as a trust." The older man rose and moved toward the table where the announcement waited, still rolled and bound with its blue ribbon. He picked it up with both hands, the way one might hold something precious, and held it out to Thomas. "This is yours now. Carry it as you have been taught." Thomas took the rolled parchment, feeling its slight weight, its solidity. The ribbon was soft beneath his fingers. He could feel the carefully formed letters through the parchment's surface, each one pressed with intention. For a moment, he simply held it, letting its reality settle into his awareness. This was his responsibility now, this small object that contained the baker's hopes and the town's knowledge of something new beginning. They made their way down the narrow stairs and into the market square as the bells began to ring for the early office. The sound was gentle in the early light, a call rather than a command. The cobblestones were still damp, reflecting the sky like dark mirrors. A few people were already moving about. A woman carrying a basket toward the river, a man leading a donkey toward the fields. But the square itself was still mostly empty, waiting. Edmund positioned himself on the stone steps that led up to the market hall, a spot where his voice would carry naturally to all corners of the square. But it was Thomas who stood at the center now, in the open space between the fountain and the baker's shop. The young man, 19 years old, with his long-fingered hands and dark hair catching the growing light, held the announcement before him, waiting for Edmund's signal. The older Herald closed his eyes for a moment, a gesture Thomas had seen him make countless times. It was not prayer exactly, though it had something of that quality. It was a moment of gathering, of preparing both mind and voice for the work of carrying words across empty space and into listening ears. When Edmund opened his eyes and nodded, Thomas took a breath and unrolled the parchment. The movement was careful, deliberate, giving those few people scattered across the square time to recognize that something was about to be announced. He could see the woman with the basket pause, could see the man with the donkey turn toward the sound of rustling paper. Thomas's voice, when it came, was clear and steady. It had been trained for 3 years to do exactly this, to carry without strain, to reach without shouting, to convey importance without false emotion. "Hear now the proclamation of the market square," he began, the traditional opening that signaled to the town that something worthy of attention was about to be said. More people were turning toward the sound now. A baker's wife, recognizing her neighbor's name in the proclamation, smiled broadly and nudged the woman beside her. An old man who had known the baker's father stepped closer, his weathered face softening with the pleasure of continuity. The words that Thomas spoke, about honest work and the opening of a new establishment, about the carrying forward of craft and tradition, seemed to take on weight and presence as they moved through the morning air. When he finished, there was a moment of quiet, and then a few people began to clap, a gentle sound that echoed off the market hall's stone. The baker himself emerged from his shop, his face bright with gratification, and raised his hand in acknowledgement. Edmund stood on the steps with his arms at his sides, his posture conveying both satisfaction and the knowledge that the work was done and required no further comment. Thomas rolled the announcement carefully, rewound the blue ribbon, and made his way back toward Edmund. The morning was fully light now. The day began in earnest. Behind them, people were already beginning to drift toward the baker's shop, some to congratulate him, some simply to mark the opening of something new. The announcement had done its work. As they climbed the stairs back toward the Herald's rooms, Edmund placed a hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture he made rarely, and which therefore carried weight. "The baker's bread will be good," the older man said, "and tomorrow, when people taste it, they will remember that they heard his opening proclaimed with care. That is what we do. You and I, we make things matter by the way we carry them." The day continued as it always did. There was a message to be delivered to the guild master, a notice about the market day's schedule to be prepared, a dispute between merchants to be formally acknowledged. Thomas moved through these tasks with the same careful attention he gave to everything, his hands steady, his voice clear, his mind present to the work at hand. By afternoon, the autumn sun had reached its highest point and begun its descent toward evening. The market square gradually emptied as merchants closed their stalls and people made their way home to prepare the evening meal. The baker's shop remained open, and Thomas caught glimpses of customers entering, the scent of fresh bread drifting across the square, a scent that seemed to carry the announcement with it, making the news visible in the air itself. Edmund had withdrawn to the inner chamber by this time, his own day's work complete. At 56 years old, the older Herald had long ago learned that wisdom lay in knowing when to rest, when to step back and allow the younger man to carry the day's remaining tasks. Thomas could hear him moving about quietly, the sound of papers being organized, the gentle clinking of cups being cleared. Thomas returned to the table where he had worked the night before. The same candles waited, ready to be lit when darkness came again. The same parchments and ink bottles stood in their proper places. The room held all the evidence of continuity, of work repeated and perfected over decades. He thought of the 3 years he had spent in this room, learning not just the words and movements of proclamation, but the deeper understanding that each announcement was a small thread connecting the town to itself, binding people together through shared knowledge. His hands, which had once been uncertain and fumbling, now moved with confidence through the small preparations. He cleaned the pens that had been used, straightened the papers that had been consulted, wiped down the table. These actions were no longer conscious choices, but rather the body's natural response to completion. The way one might brush away crumbs after eating, or fold away a blanket after waking. The work flowed through him as naturally as breathing. As evening approached and the light in the window began to soften into gold and amber, Thomas stood at that window and looked out at the market square. The baker's shop glowed warmly with candlelight, and he could see the baker inside, arranging his wares for the next day's opening. The old fountain stood silent at the square's center, its basin now reflecting the sunset colors. The cobblestones, dry now, seemed to hold the day's warmth in their stones. This was his work, Thomas understood. Not just the proclamations themselves, but this, the awareness of what announcements meant, how they connected people to the life of their community, how a voice carrying words across open space could create a kind of belonging. Edmund had understood this from the beginning and had patiently taught him to understand it too. The distant bells began to ring for vespers, calling the faithful to evening prayer. The sound was peaceful, meditative, the same bells that had rung for centuries in this town, the same rhythm that would continue long after Thomas himself had grown old and taught some younger apprentice to hear the weight of announcements and carry them with care. The weeks that followed the baker's opening settled into a rhythm as steady as the heartbeat of the town itself. Autumn deepened, the leaves turning from gold to rust to brown, and with each passing day, Thomas felt his understanding of the Herald's work deepen as well. What had seemed like a craft of words and clear voice was slowly revealing itself to be something far more subtle, a way of listening, of understanding what needed to be said and how to say it so that people truly heard. Edmund had begun to trust him with more complex announcements, not just the straightforward proclamations, shop openings, and market schedules, but the more delicate matters that required sensitivity and care. A widow's estate being offered for lease, the announcement phrased so that it honored the husband's memory while opening a new chapter. A young couple's betrothal, the words chosen to convey both joy and the proper solemnity of such a commitment. A master craftsman's retirement, the proclamation structured so that it celebrated his long service while making room for his successor to step forward. Thomas found that he was learning to read not just the words given to him, but the unspoken hopes and anxieties of those who came seeking the herald's voice. The widow who stood rigidly as she described her late husband's property had eyes that betrayed her fear of losing the home that held her memories. The young bride-to-be, trying to appear composed, could barely contain her delight. The retiring craftsman's hands trembled slightly as he specified exactly how his apprentice's name should be spoken in the announcement. One morning in late November, when the first frost had begun to whiten the grass in the meadows beyond town, a man Thomas had never seen before climbed the narrow stairs to the herald's rooms. He was a merchant of some substance, his clothing fine wool and his bearing that of someone accustomed to authority. Edmund was taking his morning tea when the man arrived, but he rose without hesitation and gestured to the visitor to sit. "I have a proclamation," the merchant said, "but it is of a delicate nature. I come to you because I have heard that your herald is thorough in his understanding." Edmund glanced at Thomas, a look that conveyed both approval and the knowledge that this was now Thomas's work to manage. The young man, 19 years old, with his long-fingered hands folded before him on the table, felt a small current of both anxiety and anticipation move through him. "I will listen," Thomas said, his voice steady in the way Edmund had taught him to make it steady, not through forcing confidence, but through attending fully to the present moment. The merchant explained his situation. He had engaged in trade with a competitor for many years, a partnership that had been mutually beneficial, but was now coming to an end. The separation was amicable enough. Both men had grown older and wished to focus on other matters, but the merchant was concerned that rumors would begin to circulate suggesting conflict or dishonesty between them. He wanted the town to understand that the partnership was concluding because of natural causes, not because of failure or betrayal. "I want the announcement to honor what we built together," the merchant said, "but also to make clear that this is an ending that both of us have chosen. Do you understand the difficulty? I need to say two things at once, completion and satisfaction, but also finality." Thomas listened without interrupting, his hands still, his attention complete. He could feel Edmund's presence in the background, observing but not intervening. When the merchant finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through the structure of what needed to be said. "What was the nature of your partnership?" Thomas asked. "Not the specific goods, but the character of your work together. How did the two of you build trust?" The merchant seemed startled by the question, as if he had expected Thomas to begin taking notes immediately. But he answered thoughtfully. "Honesty," he said finally. "We were honest with each other about our capabilities and our limitations. And patience. We took time to understand each word of our agreements rather than rushing into arrangements. And," he paused, searching for the right words, "we celebrated when the other succeeded. If his shipment arrived safely, I was genuinely glad. If my business prospered, he would take pleasure in it." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then the announcement should speak of those things," he said. "Not the end of the partnership, but the continuation of what made it work, honesty and patience and mutual regard. Those things don't end when a business arrangement ends. They become the foundation of good memory." Edmund, sipping his tea quietly in the background, made a small sound that might have been approved. Over the following days, Thomas crafted the announcement with the same care he had given to every proclamation since beginning his apprenticeship. But this one required something additional. It required him to understand not just the words, but the emotional truth beneath them. He wrote and rewrote, testing different structures, different phrasings, until finally he arrived at language that seemed to capture the merchant's intention without being either maudlin or coldly formal. When the announcement was ready, he read it aloud to Edmund, who listened with the complete attention that characterized all of his responses. The older Herald, 56 years old with his graying brown hair and his work-reddened hands, listened as though this was the first proclamation he had ever heard, not one of thousands. "Good," Edmund said when Thomas finished. "You have understood something that takes many years to learn. The words carry the truth, but only if the truth itself is present in your understanding of them. You read that announcement as if you yourself had built something valuable and were reflecting on it with both satisfaction and peace. That is why it will work." The day appointed for the announcement came cold and clear. The merchant had requested that both partners be present, standing together as the words were spoken. Thomas found this detail significant. It meant the merchant wanted public recognition of their continued accord, not merely the announcement of a business ending. The market square was well attended that morning. News of something noteworthy had somehow traveled, and people gathered with the particular quality of attention that came when something important but not alarming was about to be proclaimed. The two merchants stood side by side, gray-haired men whose faces bore the lines of decades spent in careful negotiation and honest dealing. Thomas, standing in his customary place at the square's center, felt the weight of the announcement in his hands. This was more than words on parchment. It was a moment of community witnessing, a public acknowledgement of a relationship that had served the town's economy and would continue to do so, even as its form changed. His voice, when he began to speak, carried not just the proclamation but something of the understanding that had gone into crafting it. The words about honesty and patience seemed to resonate across the square, and Thomas could see people nodding, understanding that this was not merely a business announcement, but a statement about how men of character conducted their affairs. When he finished, Both merchants stepped forward and clasped hands, a gesture that seemed to seal not the ending but the continuation of their regard for each other. The gathered crowd expressed their approval with quiet satisfaction, the kind of response that came when something right had been done rightly. As Thomas rolled the proclamation and made his way back toward Edmund, he noticed something that had not been present at other announcements. Several people, merchants themselves, he recognized, approached the two aging partners and embraced them. The public witnessing had created something more than mere information. It had created permission for private feeling to become shared feeling, for individual satisfaction to become community acknowledgement. That evening, as Thomas was preparing the rooms for the next day's work, there was a knock at the door. The older of the two merchants stood on the threshold, holding a small cloth-wrapped package. "This is for you," he said, "though Edmund will understand its meaning as well. You gave us something today, not just words, but dignity. The way you spoke those words made what we had built seem significant, not just in the moment, but in the memory. My partner and I spoke about it this afternoon, and we agreed that your understanding of what we needed to say was more perceptive than even we ourselves had been." Thomas accepted the package, uncertain how to respond to such praise. When he unwrapped it later, after the merchant had descended the stairs, he found a fine leather journal, its pages made of good quality paper, its binding supple and well crafted. "For your own use," Edmund said when Thomas showed it to him, "to record the announcements you make if you wish, or to record your own thoughts about the work. A herald should know his own voice as well as he knows the voices he carries for others." Thomas turned the journal over in his hands, feeling its quality. It seemed to him a significant object, not just a tool, but an acknowledgement that he had moved from apprenticeship into something more like partnership with his master. The winter that followed was cold and clear, the kind of winter that seemed to clarify everything it touched. The market square, when covered with frost, became almost luminous in the early morning light. Thomas found himself spending more time in those early hours before the day's work began, standing at the window of the Herald's rooms, watching the town gradually awaken. There was a particular quality to winter proclamations, he discovered. Without the bustle and activity of the warmer months, every announcement seemed to carry more weight, to echo longer in the cold air. A merchant announcing the winter's stock, a master craftsman seeking apprentices, a notice about the new schedule for the market during the season when fewer goods were traded. All of these seemed to matter more when they were spoken into the crystalline silence of a winter morning. By December, Thomas realized that he had not consulted Edmund about an announcement in more than a month. The older herald still reviewed everything, still offered his observations, but increasingly those observations took the form of affirmation rather than correction. "You have understood this correctly," Edmund would say, or "your instinct about the packing is sound," or sometimes simply, "this is good work." On the winter solstice, when the day was shortest and the darkness deepest, Edmund suggested that they close the herald's rooms early and walk together through the town. The older man, 56 years old, moved with the same steady grace that had characterized all his movements, but his pace was leisurely, as if the walk itself was the purpose rather than any destination. They passed the baker's shop, where fresh bread was cooling on racks visible through the window. They passed the guild hall, where craftsmen were gathering for the evening celebration of the solstice. They passed the monastery, where the monks were preparing for the longest night office, the singing that would carry through the darkest hours. "In another year or two," Edmund said as they stood at the fountain's edge, looking out at the darkening square, "I will step back from this work entirely. My joints tell me that the time approaches when I should rest more fully. The town will need a herald who can carry his duties for many years to come." Thomas felt something shift in his understanding of these words. He had known, intellectually, that Edmund would eventually retire, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a different way. He looked at his master, the silver-streaked hair, the weathered hands, the measured pace, and saw not exactly decline, but the natural rhythm of a life completing one chapter and preparing to move into another. "I am not ready," Thomas said, hearing the honesty in his own voice. "No," Edmund agreed, "but you will be, and that is the difference between an apprentice and a true herald. The apprentice believes he must be ready before he begins. The true herald understands that readiness comes through doing the work with honesty and care. You are already most of the way there." They stood together in the deepening twilight, and Thomas felt the cold of the winter air, the solidity of the fountain beneath his hand, the distant sound of monastery bells beginning their evening song. The day was ending, but the world continued. The announcements would continue. The town would continue. And he, Thomas, 19 years old, with his long-fingered hands and dark hair now showing the first suggestions of the man he would become, would continue to carry words across the market square, making connections, creating moments of shared understanding. The solstice night came and passed, as solstice nights do, and with it came the knowledge that the days would gradually lengthen again. Thomas found this reassuring, the certainty that darkness itself was not permanent, that the year turned into its proper season, that all things had their time. The new year arrived quietly, as New Year's do, with no fanfare beyond what the calendar prescribed. Thomas marked it with a small ceremony of his own. He opened the leather journal the merchants had given him and wrote the date in careful script. "The first day of the year of our Lord, 1274. Beneath this, he added a single sentence: "I am learning to listen before I speak." Edmund, observing this ritual from across the room, smiled in a way that suggested approval without need for comment. The older herald was spending more time resting now, his afternoons often occupied by sitting in the chair by the window, watching the market square with the detached interest of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the patterns of community life. He was 56 years old, and while his body remained capable of all its duties, there was a quality of drawing inward that suggested his mind was already beginning to prepare for the transition. Winter deepened into its most severe phase in late January, when snow fell so thickly that the market square disappeared entirely beneath a blanket of white, and the very stones of the buildings seemed to pull themselves inward for warmth. During these days, when few people ventured out and fewer announcements needed to be made, Thomas found time to truly understand the work Edmund had been teaching him. He began to understand that a herald was not merely a voice, but a kind of translator. The merchants and guild masters and ordinary people who came to commission announcements often knew what they wanted to say, but they struggled with how to say it in a way that would carry properly across the square and lodge itself in the memory of listeners. Thomas's role was to help them find their own deepest meaning and give it form. One afternoon, when snow was falling so thickly that the world beyond the window seemed to exist only in shades of white and gray, a woman climbed the narrow stairs to the herald's rooms. She was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in the modest clothing of a woman of some substance but not great wealth, the wife of a merchant or a master craftsman. Thomas guessed from her bearing. "I need to commission an announcement," she said without preamble, "but I am not certain what I wanted to say, only that it must be said publicly and with proper solemnity." Edmund, who had been sitting by the window observing the snow, rose to greet her, but it was clear from his gesture that he meant for Thomas to conduct the conversation. The young man, now 19 years old with his long-fingered hands and dark hair, gestured for the woman to sit. "Tell me what has happened," Thomas said. "Not what you want announced, but what the situation is." The woman took a breath and her eyes grew distant. "My daughter has been offered a position as a companion to the wife of a nobleman. It is a remarkable opportunity. She will leave our town and travel to a great house where she will learn things that could never be learned here. She will have security, status, and opportunity." The woman paused, and Thomas could see conflict moving across her face. "But she will also leave. She will become part of a world that I cannot enter. And I must announce this publicly, because if I do not, the town will begin to speculate and invent rumors, and those rumors will diminish what is actually a good thing." Thomas listened without interrupting, understanding that the woman was not asking for help with words, but with the deeper work of making peace with a change she could not prevent but could honor. "What is your daughter's name?" he asked. "Margaret," the woman replied. "She is 16 years old and she has always been thoughtful and careful in her manner. She will serve well in such a position." "And this opportunity, does it come from a family friend, or how has it come about?" "From the nobleman's wife herself, who visited here last summer. She stayed in our home, and she and Margaret spent considerable time together. The wife has no daughters of her own, and she was taken with Margaret's quiet competence and kind nature." Thomas found himself understanding something then, not just the facts of the situation, but the deeper current beneath them. This was not a daughter being sent away because she was burdensome, but a daughter being chosen because she was valuable, a distinction that made all the difference. "I will need to think about this," Thomas said. "Will you return tomorrow in the morning? I believe I will have something for you to consider." The woman left, and Thomas sat for a long time in the gathering darkness of the afternoon, thinking. Edmund did not interrupt his thinking, but simply returned to his chair by the window, watching the snow continue its gentle fall. That night, Thomas opened his leather journal and began to write. Not a proclamation yet, but an exploration of what needed to be said. He wrote about the nature of growth and how it requires leaving. He wrote about the honor that comes from being chosen for something important. He wrote about the kind of love that releases rather than holds, that celebrates the beloved's advancement even at cost to oneself. By the time he finished, it was late, and Edmund had long since retired to his chamber. But Thomas understood now what the announcement should be. It was not an announcement about a daughter leaving, but about a daughter being honored through selection. It was not about loss, but about the expansion of a family's influence and pride through one member's success. When the woman returned the next morning, Thomas read the proclamation aloud to her. It spoke of how the town had the privilege of raising children, and how the greatest honor a parent could receive was to see a child chosen for something worthy of her nature. It named Margaret specifically and described her virtues, her thoughtfulness, her competence, her kindness, in a way that made clear these were the very qualities that had earned her the position. It ended by announcing that Margaret would depart within the month, and that the town should know her as a credit to her upbringing and a representative of the values that the community held dear. The woman wept quietly as she listened, but they were not tears of sorrow. When she finished listening, she was silent for a long moment. "You have made me understand something I needed to understand," she said finally. "You have taken what feels like loss and shown me that it is actually completion. My daughter will leave, yes, but she will leave as someone the town recognizes as worthy. That is a comfort I did not know I needed." The announcement was made on a clear morning in February, when the snow had begun to melt, and the first hints of spring were beginning to suggest themselves in the form of longer light and the sound of water running from the eaves. The market square was moderately attended, fewer people than would gather for a major announcement, but enough to give proper witness. Thomas stood in his customary place and spoke the proclamation with the care it deserved. He could see Margaret standing with her mother, a young woman with steady eyes and a composed bearing that suggested she understood the weight of what was being said. When the announcement was complete, several people, women who knew Margaret's mother, craftsmen who had apprentices, approached the family and offered their congratulations. The effect was exactly what the woman had hoped for. By the time the market square emptied and people returned to their daily work, the knowledge of Margaret's departure had been transformed from rumor and speculation into something honored and celebrated. The young woman's leaving would be understood not as failure or loss, but as success and advancement. That evening, Edmund called Thomas to sit with him by the fire. The older Herald, 56 years old, was wrapped in a wool blanket, and there was about him a quality of weariness that suggested the winter had taken more from him than previous winters had done. "You are ready," Edmund said simply. "Not for all things. There will always be situations that require more experience and wisdom than you possess, but you are ready to carry the work that needs to be carried. You understand now that the Herald's voice is not his own, but a tool that belongs to the community. And you understand how to listen to what people truly need to say beneath the words they speak." Thomas felt something settle in his chest at these words, not relief exactly, but recognition. He had known intellectually that he was becoming more capable, but hearing Edmund speak it aloud made it real in a new way. "When do you mean to step back?" Thomas asked. "Gradually," Edmund replied. "I will continue to work through the spring and into summer, but by autumn, I think I will be ready to let this pass entirely to you, and I will be content to sit by the window and observe, knowing that the work continues in capable hands. Spring came early that year, arriving in late February with warm days that made the snow disappear almost overnight. The market square transformed from a quiet winter landscape into a bustling center of activity as merchants reopened their stalls and the rhythm of the town accelerated. With the increased activity came more announcements. A master stonemason begins a project to repair the church's bell tower. A guild of weavers establishing new standards for the quality of cloth. A widow reopening her late husband's tavern. A young couple announcing their betrothal. A death. An elderly man of great respect who had lived nearly 80 years, requiring an announcement that would serve as both notification and eulogy. Thomas moved through these announcements with increasing confidence, though he never allowed confidence to become carelessness. Each proclamation received the same careful attention he had learned from Edmund, the same willingness to understand what lay beneath the surface of what was being asked. By mid-March, when the first green shoots were beginning to push through the darkening earth, and the birds had returned from their winter absence, Thomas realized that he had not consulted Edmund about the structure of an announcement in more than 6 weeks. The older Herald still reviewed everything, still offered his observations, but those observations had become increasingly terse, more in the nature of affirmation than guidance. One morning, Edmund did not come downstairs for the morning tea. Thomas, concerned, climbed to his master's chamber and found the older man still abed, though the morning was well advanced. Edmund's face held a flush that suggested fever, and his breathing seemed to come with more effort than usual. "It is nothing serious," Edmund said when Thomas's concern became visible. "Only that my body is reminding me that I have lived 56 years, and those years have accumulated in ways I can no longer ignore. I will rest today, and by tomorrow I will be restored." But Edmund did not recover by the next day, nor the day after that. A physician was called, an old woman who had attended births and treated ailments throughout the town for 40 years. She examined Edmund with careful hands and pronounced him to be suffering from the kind of inflammation of the chest that sometimes came with the change from winter to spring. "Rest and warmth in time," she said, "and he will likely recover. But he must be careful not to overtax himself. His body is telling him something that he should heed." For the first time since beginning his apprenticeship, Thomas found himself making the announcements alone, without Edmund's presence in the background or his review afterward. It was a strange experience, liberating and terrifying in equal measure. He found himself pausing before each proclamation, asking himself the questions that Edmund had taught him to ask. What does this person truly need to say? What do the people of the town need to hear? How can I make the truth of this moment carry across the square and lodge in memory? And to his surprise, he found that he could answer those questions. The training had become not external guidance but internal understanding. Edmund's voice had become, in a sense, his own voice, not replacing his individual judgment but informing it, guiding it, shaping it toward wisdom and care. Edmund recovered gradually, but it was clear that the illness had cost him something. When he finally came downstairs again, after nearly 3 weeks of rest. He moved more slowly than before, and there was about him a quality of having turned inward that suggested his body had made a decision he could not overrule. "You have done well," he said to Thomas, after reviewing the announcements that had been made during his illness. "Better than well. You have done this work with the care it requires and the wisdom it deserves. I am ready now to step fully back." "But you will still review," Thomas began. "No," Edmund said gently. "The work is yours now. The town is yours to serve. I will observe if you will allow it, and I will be here if you have questions that require my experience. But the voice that carries the town's announcements must be your voice now, not mine speaking through you." Thomas felt the weight of this transition, the moment when apprenticeship truly ended and the work became his own responsibility entirely. But beneath the weight, he felt also a rightness, a sense that this was exactly as it should be. The spring deepened into early summer, and with it came a transformation in the rhythm of the Herald's rooms. Edmund, now spending most of his time in the chair by the window, became observer rather than participant. He would watch the market square with the gentle detachment of someone whose long engagement with a place had earned him the privilege of stepping back from it. Sometimes people would climb the stairs specifically to greet the retired herald, and Edmund would receive them with the same unhurried courtesy that had characterized all his interactions. Thomas found himself working alone now in ways he had not anticipated. The solitude, which he had sometimes imagined would be lonely, proved instead to be clarifying. Without Edmund's presence shaping the space around him, Thomas discovered that his own understanding of the work deepened. He began to develop small practices that were entirely his own, a particular way of preparing himself before standing in the market square, a habit of reviewing each announcement in his leather journal after it was made, a method of organizing the materials on his work table that reflected his own sense of order rather than the inherited arrangement. In late April, when the apple trees were in blossom and the smell of their flowers carried across the entire town on warm afternoons, Thomas made a discovery about the nature of his work that he had not anticipated. A merchant came to commission an announcement about a new trade route that had been established, connecting the town to markets in the north that had previously been difficult to reach. The merchant was young and eager, his enthusiasm evident in the rapid way he spoke and the gestures that accompanied his words. "This will change everything," he said. "It will bring new goods, new opportunities, new connections to the wider world. The announcement must convey the significance of this moment." But as Thomas listened and asked his customary questions, he began to understand something beneath the merchant's excitement. The man had invested everything in making this route work. If it succeeded, he would be wealthy and established. If it failed, he would lose not only his investment but his standing in the community. The excitement was real, but it was balanced by a weight of anxiety that the merchant himself might not fully have acknowledged. Thomas understood then that his task was not to amplify the merchant's excitement into a grand proclamation, but to help him acknowledge the genuine nature of what he had accomplished, the risk he had taken, the effort he had invested, and the hope he carried for success. The announcement should convey not false confidence, but honest recognition of a significant undertaking. When he crafted the proclamation, Thomas found himself drawing on a kind of understanding that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The words he chose spoke of the merchant's courage in establishing a difficult connection, and of the town's good fortune in having someone willing to take such risks. It described the new trade route in practical terms, but also in terms of what it represented, a reaching towards something beyond the familiar, a trust in possibility. When the merchant heard the announcement read aloud, his eyes grew bright with emotion. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, that is exactly what it is. You have understood what I was doing beneath what I thought I was doing." After the merchant left, Thomas sat for a long time in the quiet of the Herald's rooms. Edmund, from his chair by the window, made a small sound, not quite speech, but something between acknowledgement and approval. "You have discovered something important," the older man said, his voice thin now but still carrying the quality of careful attention. "The best heralds do not simply convey information. They help people understand the significance of their own lives. You have begun to do that. It will serve you well." The summer continued its slow unfolding, and Thomas found himself increasingly occupied with the work that had once seemed so simple, but now revealed itself to be deeply complex. Each proclamation was a kind of conversation with the person commissioning it, not spoken conversation, but a conversation of understanding, where Thomas helped people articulate what they most needed the town to know. There was an elderly craftsman announcing his retirement after 50 years of making furniture. Thomas helped him understand that his announcement should speak not of ending, but of legacy, of the apprentices he had trained, the beauty he had created, the standards he had maintained. The proclamation became not a farewell but a handing down, a moment in which the craftsman could see his life's work reflected back to him in its full significance. There was a young woman announcing her intention to enter religious life, leaving the town to join a convent in a distant city. Thomas helped her family understand that this was not loss but fulfillment, that their daughter was answering a call that had nothing to do with deficiency in the home she was leaving, and everything to do with something deeper that had called to her since childhood. The announcement honored her choice and the family's willingness to release her to it. There was a dispute between two guild masters that threatened to become public conflict. Thomas, consulting with both men separately, helped them understand that they could announce a structured resolution that would preserve both their honor and their ability to work together in the future. The proclamation described the dispute and its resolution in language that made clear both men had acted with integrity and wisdom. Through all of these situations, Thomas became aware that he was not simply learning a craft, but entering into a kind of ministry. The herald was a kind of priest of the ordinary, someone who helped people understand the spiritual significance of their everyday choices. Edmund, watching from his window, seemed to recognize this understanding as it emerged. By midsummer, Edmund's health began to decline more noticeably. The inflammation in his chest had resolved, but it had left him diminished in energy and appetite. He spent more time sleeping, and when he was awake, his attention seemed to drift between the present moment and some internal landscape that Thomas could only guess at. One warm afternoon in July, when the market square shimmered with heat and few people ventured out except for necessary business, Edmund asked Thomas to sit with him. "I want to tell you something," the older man said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Something that I have not spoken aloud before, but that I wish you to know and carry forward." Thomas pulled his chair close, giving Edmund his complete attention in the way the older man had taught him. "When I was young," Edmund began, "I thought that the work of being a herald was about having a good voice and speaking clearly and remembering the words that needed to be said. I thought it was a craft of external things, technique and skill and presence. But over the decades, I came to understand that it was something altogether different." Edmund paused, gathering his breath. The true work of a herald is to help people understand that their lives matter. In a small town, most people's lives are not recorded in grand histories or celebrated in distant places. But they matter. They matter to the people around them. They matter to the community. They matter to God if you believe in such things. And a herald is someone who helps people see that significance, who gives voice to the quiet importance of ordinary lives. The older man, 56 years old though he seemed much older now, closed his eyes as if the effort of speaking had cost him greatly. "You have learned this," Edmund continued. "I saw it begin to happen around the spring equinox, and I have watched it deepen through the summer. You understand now that your voice is not about you, but about helping other people understand themselves. That is everything. When you can do that with consistency and care, you will be a true herald." Thomas found himself unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. Edmund seemed to sense this and did not press for response. Instead, the older man opened his eyes and looked out toward the window, where the market square lay peaceful and quiet in the summer heat. "I am ready now," Edmund said, more to himself than to Thomas. "I have done what I came to do. I have passed on the understanding and I have seen it taken root. It is enough." In the days that followed, Edmund grew gradually quieter. He spent most of his time sleeping, waking occasionally to take small amounts of food or liquid. A physician came again, the same elderly woman who had attended him during his spring illness. She examined him with careful hands and spoke quietly with Thomas. "His body is worn," she said. "He has lived well and fully, and his body is telling him that the time of rest has come. There is nothing to be done except to make him comfortable and let the natural order proceed." Thomas found himself unable to leave the herald's rooms, though there were proclamations to be made and announcements to be prepared. Instead, he sat with Edmund through the long summer days, reading aloud from the Psalter, or simply sitting in companionable silence. On the evening of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, when the light lingered until very late into the night, Edmund woke more alert than he had been in days. "Come," he said to Thomas, "help me to the window. I want to see the square one more time in the full light of day." Thomas helped the older man to his feet, supporting much of his weight. They moved slowly to the window that looked out over the market square. The evening light was golden and rich, painting everything in warm tones. The square was moderately busy, people finishing business before the evening meal, merchants closing their stalls, children running in the open space before being called home. "It is a good town," Edmund said, his voice barely audible. "Full of ordinary people doing ordinary things with integrity and care. This is the kingdom that a herald serves, not kings or great lords, but the quiet community of people trying to live well and understand themselves." Edmund was silent for a long moment, watching the square. "When I am gone," he said finally, "do not mourn me as though something has been taken away. Instead, understand that I have completed my task and can rest. The work continues for you. The town will continue to need a voice that helps it understand itself. You are that voice now." As the light faded that evening and darkness began to settle over the town, Edmund asked to be helped back to his bed. Thomas settled him under a wool blanket, made sure the window was open to catch the cool night air, and prepared to sit vigil through the night. But Edmund's breathing gradually became more shallow, and somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, it simply stopped. Thomas, who had been dozing in a chair beside the bed, woke to a silence that seemed to have weight and presence. He sat for a long time with the body of his master, the man who had been 56 years old, with his silver-streaked brown hair and his work-reddened hands that had carried the town's announcements for 30 years. Even in death, Edmund's face held the quality of peaceful attention that had characterized his life. He looked like someone who had finally arrived at a place he had been traveling toward for a long time. When dawn broke, Thomas knew what he had to do. He washed Edmund's body with the care the older man deserved, dressed him in clean linen, and then made his way down to the market square. The morning was clear and cool, the first hint of autumn beginning to suggest itself in the quality of the light. Thomas stood in his customary place and lifted his voice to carry across the square. "Hear now the proclamation of the market square," he began, using the traditional opening, though his voice wavered slightly with the weight of what he was about to announce. The gathered people, merchants beginning their day, women coming to the market, craftsmen on their way to their workshops, turned toward the sound. "Edmund of this town," Thomas said, and his voice steadied as he spoke, "Herald of 30 years, has completed his labor. He has spent his life helping this community understand itself, giving voice to our joys and our sorrows, our accomplishments and our transitions. He did this work with patience and wisdom, and with a heart that cared deeply for the people he served." Thomas paused, feeling Edmund's presence somehow in the square itself, in the stones and the light and the gathered people. "Edmund was a healer of the spirit," Thomas continued. "Not through medicines or prayers, but through helping ordinary people understand the significance of their ordinary lives. We will not see him in the market square again, but we will feel his presence every time we remember that our lives matter, that our choices have weight, that our community's understanding of itself is sacred work." The market square was very quiet. When Thomas finished the proclamation and bowed slightly in acknowledgement of the moment's weight, several people stepped forward, merchants whom Edmund had helped, craftsmen whose work had been honored in the herald's voice, women whose sorrows had been given proper recognition. They approached the place where Thomas stood, and one by one, they clasped his hands or placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of shared grief and continuity. The community was acknowledging not just Edmund's passing, but Thomas's transition into the full mantle of Herald. The funeral of Edmund took place 3 days later, as was customary. Thomas participated in the service, but found himself standing somewhat apart from it, aware that he was no longer quite an apprentice, but not yet fully established in the role that had passed to him. After Edmund was laid to rest in the cemetery beside the monastery, the town seemed to settle into a kind of waiting to see how Thomas would carry forward the work that Edmund had held for so long. In the days immediately following the funeral, Thomas made a decision. He took Edmund's chair from beside the window and moved it to a corner of the room where it would not dominate the space, but where it would remain visible, a reminder of the man who had sat there, observing and guiding for so many months. In its place, Thomas arranged his own workspace more fully, moving his leather journal to a more prominent position on the table, setting up the pens and inks in a configuration that reflected his own sense of order. The first significant announcement Thomas made as sole herald came in early August, nearly 2 weeks after Edmund's death. A widow, not the same woman whose husband's property had been announced years before, but a different widow, newer to her loss, came to commission an announcement about her late husband's will and the distribution of his property to his 3 sons. It was a delicate matter. The woman's voice, as she described the situation, carried undertones of anxiety. One of the sons had been in dispute with his father over the years, and though the will had been written to include him fairly, the widow feared that the town might speculate about resentment or favoritism. Thomas listened with the kind of complete attention that Edmund had modeled for him, and he understood that what the widow truly needed was for the town to witness that the will represented her late husband's final word on these matters, that it was not a reflection of current tensions, but of his ultimate judgment about his sons and their deserving. When Thomas crafted the proclamation, he found himself drawing on something that seemed to come from deep within himself, not from Edmund's teaching, though that teaching formed the foundation, but from his own understanding of how language could carry truth. The announcement spoke of the late husband as a man of considered judgment, and it presented the distribution of property as his final expression of love and fairness toward his sons. It did not ignore the reality that there had been tensions over the years. To ignore this would make the proclamation seem false, but instead it framed those tensions as part of a father's lifelong process of understanding his children and judging what would serve them best. When the widow heard the proclamation, she wept, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. "You have given me back my husband's voice," she said. "You have made clear what he would have wanted to understand." After she left, Thomas sat alone in the Herald's rooms and felt something shift within himself. It was not that he had become Edmund. He would never be Edmund, would never have those particular qualities that the older man had possessed. But he had become something that Edmund's teaching and his own careful attention had created. A true herald, someone who understood the sacred work of helping a community understand itself. The weeks that followed were filled with a kind of settling. Thomas continued to make announcements, a master mason hearing new apprentices, a young couple announcing their betrothal, a guild master stepping down from leadership to pass his responsibilities to the next generation. Each proclamation received the care it deserved, and Thomas found himself becoming more confident in his ability to understand what needed to be said beneath the surface of what was being asked. By late August, when the first hints of autumn were beginning to color the edges of the leaves, and the quality of the light was subtly shifting toward the angle it would hold in fall, something unexpected happened. Thomas was approached by the monastery's master of scribes, an elderly monk named Brother Cuthbert, who had been copying manuscripts for more than 40 years. "I have a request," Brother Cuthbert said, his voice carrying the particular quality of one who had spent decades in silence and now spoke only when necessary. "It is unusual, and I am not certain whether it is within the province of a herald to accommodate it, but I wish to ask." Thomas gestured for the monk to sit, curious about what could be so unusual as to bring Brother Cuthbert to seek the herald's assistance. "We are completing a manuscript," Brother Cuthbert explained. "A psalter of particular beauty, copied by the hands of 3 generations of our community's scribes. It has taken nearly 70 years to complete, and we wish to present it to the monastery's library with a proclamation, not a public announcement in the square, but a formal declaration that can be read aloud and recorded in our archives." Thomas felt a small thrill at this request. It was indeed unusual. He had never been asked to create a proclamation for a monastic ceremony, but it seemed to him entirely within the spirit of the work that Edmund had trained him to do. "I would be honored," Thomas said. "When would you wish this to take place?" "On the feast of St. Cuthbert," Brother Cuthbert replied, "which falls in November. It will give us time to complete the final bindings and make ready for the ceremony." Over the following weeks, Thomas worked with Brother Cuthbert to understand the full significance of what was being marked. The Psalter was not simply a book. It was a record of continuity across generations, a physical manifestation of the community's spiritual life, a gift that the monastery was making for its own future. 3 scribes, separated by decades, had each contributed their hands, their eyes, their prayers to the creation of this single object. Thomas understood that the proclamation needed to honor not just the completion but the journey, the 70 years of patient work, the succession of hands that had held the pens, the intention that had sustained the work across generations. It needed to make clear that this was not merely a book, but a kind of prayer made visible. When autumn arrived in full force, the leaves turning brilliant colors, the air becoming crisp with the promise of winter, Thomas stood in the monastery's scriptorium and read the proclamation he had crafted. The room was filled with monks, and the light from the high windows illuminated the Psalter as it rested on its reading desk, its binding luminous with gold leaf and careful artistry. Thomas's voice carried the words across the quiet space, and he felt the weight of what was being honored, not just the finished object, but the 70 years of dedication, the discipline of copying letter by letter, word by word, page by page, the faith that sustained work that no single person would live to see completed. When he finished, the monks began to sing, a chant that seemed to rise naturally from the moment itself, filling the scriptorium with sound that was both ancient and immediate. Thomas found himself moved by the beauty of it, by the way the proclamation had created a threshold that the community then crossed together into something sacred. In the months that followed Edmund's death, Thomas realized that his understanding of the Herald's work had expanded in ways he could not have anticipated. He was not simply a voice carrying announcements across the market square. He was a kind of keeper of meaning, someone entrusted with helping communities recognize and honor the significance of their own lives and work. By November, when autumn was giving way to winter and the first snows began to fall, Thomas found himself increasingly confident in the work. He had made hundreds of proclamations now, some grand, most small and ordinary, and each one had taught him something about the nature of human life and community. One afternoon, as he was working at his table preparing an announcement about a merchant's daughter entering into betrothal, Thomas heard footsteps on the stairs. A young man appeared at the door, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, with the uncertain bearing of someone not quite at ease with his own height and strength. "I am looking for the Herald," the young man said. "I have been told that the Herald takes apprentices." Thomas felt something in his chest expand at these words. The thought of having an apprentice had not occurred to him. He had been so occupied with establishing himself in the role that Edmund had left behind that he had not considered the continuation of the tradition. "What is your name?" Thomas asked, setting aside his work. "Robert," the young man replied. "I am the blacksmith's youngest son. My father says I have a voice that carries well, and that I seem to notice things that others overlook. He thought I might be suited to this work." Thomas studied the young man carefully, seeing in him something of his own younger self, the uncertainty mixed with a kind of hunger to understand something meaningful, the sense that there was work in the world that mattered. "Come," Thomas said. "Sit. I will tell you about the work of a herald, and you will tell me why you believe you are suited to it." As Thomas began to speak to Robert about the craft that Edmund had taught him, and that he had continued to develop, he found himself aware of the full circle that was completing. Edmund had taken him in as an uncertain apprentice, and had patiently taught him not just a craft, but a way of understanding human life and community. Now Thomas found himself in the position of being the teacher, the one who would pass on the understanding he had received. The evening light was beginning to shift toward the golden tones of early winter, and the market square below was quiet, most people having completed their day's work. But tomorrow, there would be announcements to make, stories to help people tell, moments of significance to help the community recognize and honor. Thomas looked at young Robert, this potential apprentice whose father had seen something in him that suggested the capacity for this work, and thought of Edmund sitting by the window, observing, guiding, preparing Thomas for the moment when the responsibility would pass entirely into his hands. The tradition would continue. The herald's voice would continue to carry across the market square, helping ordinary people understand that their lives mattered, that their choices had weight, that the community's understanding of itself was sacred work worthy of attention and care. And Thomas, 19 years old when he had begun, now 21 or 22, he had become not just a herald but a teacher, someone who would guide the next generation into this ancient and necessary work. The winter that followed was unlike any Thomas had experienced before. With Robert beginning his apprenticeship in November, the Herald's rooms took on a different character. No longer the space of a single person learning a craft, but now a place where knowledge was being actively passed from one generation to the next. Thomas found himself understanding Edmund's patience in a new way. Teaching Robert forced him to articulate things that had become so intuitive in his own practice that he had nearly forgotten they were skills to be learned. When Robert asked, "But how do you know what the person truly needs to say?" Thomas had to pause and consider the question seriously, and had to trace back through his own learning to find the answer. "You listen," Thomas told the young man, "not just to the words they speak, but to what lives beneath the words. Listen to their voice. Is it anxious, proud, grieving, joyful? The emotional truth beneath the request will tell you what needs to be honored in the proclamation." Robert, who was 17 years old with the serious bearing of someone taking his responsibility with great care, would nod and write observations in a small notebook he had begun to keep. Thomas recognized something of himself in the young man's approach. This willingness to attend carefully to small details, to understand that significance could hide itself in seemingly ordinary moments. The first weeks of Robert's apprenticeship were occupied with the most basic aspects of the work. Thomas taught him how to hold a pen properly, how to form letters with consistency and care, how to prepare parchment for writing. These technical skills were foundational, but Thomas was careful to frame them in a way that suggested their deeper meaning. "When you write a letter," Thomas explained, "you are creating something that will be heard aloud by a voice that is not your own. Your penmanship must be clear enough that no one reading it will hesitate or stumble. Every mark you make should serve the eventual proclamation. There is a kind of meditation in this work. Your hands become part of the chain of intention that connects the person commissioning the announcement to the ears of those who will hear it." Robert absorbed these lessons with the kind of complete attention that suggested he understood their weight. In the evenings, after the day's work was complete, Thomas would often find Robert practicing his lettering long into the night, the candle burning lower and lower as the young man worked to perfect the formation of each character. By December, when winter had settled in fully and snow lay thick on the cobblestones of the market square, Robert was beginning to participate in the actual work of creating proclamations. Thomas would bring him into consultations with people commissioning announcements, and Robert would listen, his notebook in hand, his attention complete, as people described what needed to be said. One afternoon, as a merchant was describing his need for an announcement about the closure of his shop for the winter months, Thomas watched Robert's eyes and saw the moment when the young man understood something beyond the literal words being spoken. The merchant was saying that he would reopen in spring, but what his voice conveyed was anxiety, fear that he might not have the resources to reopen, uncertainty about whether his business would survive the winter closure. After the merchant left, Thomas asked Robert what he had observed. "He is worried," Robert said slowly, "not just about the closure, but about whether he can afford to reopen. He spoke about spring as though he was not certain he would see it." Thomas nodded. "Yes, And what should the announcement do with that understanding? Robert considered this carefully. It should not deny the worry, he said finally, but it should frame the closure as a natural part of the year's rhythm, not as failure. It should make clear that the merchant has been here before and will be here again. Thomas felt a small warmth of satisfaction at this response. Robert was beginning to understand that the Herald's work required compassion, the ability to recognize anxiety and fear without being overwhelmed by it, and to help people transform those feelings into something that could be shared with the community in a way that honored both the person and the listening ears. The proclamation that Thomas crafted drew on Robert's insight. It spoke of the merchant's many years of service to the town and of the natural rhythm of seasons that governed all work. It described the winter closure not as uncertainty, but as the necessary rest that all things required, and it ended with a quiet affirmation that when spring came, the merchant would reopen his doors, as he had done year after year. When the merchant heard the proclamation, his eyes grew bright, and he thanked Thomas with visible emotion. Later, Robert asked why the merchant had responded so strongly. Because, Thomas explained, he came in anxiety, wondering if the town would see his closure as failure. The proclamation helped him, and the listening community, understand that it is not failure but rhythm. You gave him that gift through your observation. As winter deepened, Robert began to assist Thomas in making the actual proclamations in the market square. At first, the young man simply stood nearby, observing, understanding the physical reality of standing before the gathered community and carrying words across open space. But gradually, Thomas began to have Robert read some of the simpler announcements, notices about market schedules, changes in the time of guild meetings, straightforward information that required a clear voice but less emotional complexity. Thomas watched from a slight distance as Robert made his first independent proclamation, a notice about the monastery's winter schedule for prayer services. The young man's voice was uncertain at first, but as he continued speaking, it grew steadier. By the time he finished, his voice had found its own character, not imitating Thomas's style, but developing its own quality that was younger, fresher, but no less capable of carrying significance. In January, as the deepest part of winter settled over the town and the days were shortest and coldest, Thomas made a discovery about Robert that surprised and pleased him. The young man had begun to compose his own versions of proclamations, imagining how he would craft announcements for situations he had observed or heard about. One evening, Thomas found Robert at the table working by candlelight, his face concentrated in thought. Before him lay a practice proclamation about a young woman who had recently been chosen as a nursemaid to the nobleman's children, a position of some responsibility and honor. Thomas read Robert's draft carefully and found it to be good, sensitive to the significance of the position, attentive to the young woman's own feelings about the responsibility she was taking on, and phrased in language that would carry the weight of the moment properly. "This is excellent work," Thomas said, and he meant it. "Where did the inspiration come from?" "I was in the market yesterday," Robert replied, "and I saw the girl. Her name is Catherine, I think, talking with her mother. The mother was proud but also worried, and Catherine seemed both excited and frightened. I thought about how an announcement of this position might help both of them understand that the pride and the worry and the excitement all had a place in what was happening. Thomas felt something settle in him at this moment. Robert was not simply learning to reproduce the work that Thomas had learned from Edmund. He was beginning to develop his own understanding, his own sensitivity to the human complexity beneath the surface of events. This was exactly as it should be, each generation bringing its own gifts to the work, building on what had been taught but adding something new. By February, when the first hints of spring were beginning to whisper beneath the still frozen surface of winter, Thomas made a decision. He asked Robert if he would be willing to take responsibility for a significant proclamation, not simply assisting, but fully conceiving and crafting an announcement from initial consultation through final delivery. A widow had come requesting an announcement about her late husband's apprentice, a young man who had worked under her husband for 8 years and was now ready to establish his own workshop. The apprentice had no family in the town, and the widow wanted the community to recognize and honor his transition from apprentice to independent craftsman. "I want you to handle this," Thomas told Robert. "Meet with the widow and the young man, understand what needs to be said, craft the proclamation, and then stand in the market square and deliver it." Robert's face went pale. "Alone?" he asked. "I will be nearby," Thomas assured him, "but the work will be yours. This is the moment when you move from an apprentice to someone who is beginning to understand the full weight of this calling." Over the following days, Thomas observed as Robert met with the widow and the young craftsman. The young apprentice-turned-master was nervous about being proclaimed in the square. He had lived a quiet life, and the thought of public acknowledgement made him anxious. But Robert, with a sensitivity that seemed to come from his own understanding of nervousness and growth, helped him see that the proclamation was not about drawing attention to him, but about helping the community recognize the completion of a significant journey. When Robert finally stood in the market square on a morning in late February, his voice carried across the empty space with a clarity that surprised Thomas. The proclamation spoke of 8 years of patient learning, of mastery earned through dedication and care, of the community's good fortune in gaining another skilled craftsman. It named the young man specifically and invited the listening ears to recognize him not with fanfare or drama, but with the quiet respect due to someone who had worked hard and was now ready to take his place among the community's skilled workers. When it was finished, the young craftsman stepped forward and accepted the acknowledgement with a kind of peaceful gratitude that suggested Robert had understood exactly what was needed. Later, the widow approached Thomas directly. "Your apprentice has a gift," she said. "He listened to my concerns and to the young man's fears, and he somehow crafted words that transformed both of those into something beautiful. He has the makings of a true herald." That evening, Thomas and Robert sat together by the fire in the herald's rooms, and Thomas formally acknowledged the moment that had passed between them. "You are no longer simply an apprentice," Thomas said. "You are becoming a herald. There is much more to learn, and you will continue to deepen your understanding for many years to come. but you have demonstrated that you understand the essential thing, that this work is about helping people recognize the significance of their own lives. Robert, 17 years old, with his serious bearing and his notebook of observations, looked at Thomas with an expression that mixed gratitude with the weight of understanding what lay ahead. "Will I ever feel certain that I am doing this correctly?" Robert asked. Thomas thought of Edmund sitting by the window and of the older man's gentle acknowledgement of Thomas's early uncertainties. "No," he said honestly. "There will always be moments of doubt, always situations that challenge you, always the question of whether you have truly understood what needs to be said. But that very uncertainty, that willingness to continue questioning, is what keeps the work honest and true. The moment you become certain that you know everything about how to do this work is the moment you stop truly listening." As the winter gave way to spring, the work of the Herald continued. Announcements made, proclamations carried across the market square, the community learning about itself through the careful words that Thomas and Robert carried. The rhythm of the town continued, seasons turning, people being born and growing and aging and passing away. And through all of it, the Herald's voice helped the community understand that all of these ordinary moments mattered, that every transition and every accomplishment and every loss was worthy of recognition and care. Thomas, now in his early 20s, found himself settled in a way he had not anticipated when Edmund first took him in as an uncertain apprentice. He was not simply a herald now. He was a teacher, a keeper of tradition, someone responsible for passing on understanding to the next generation. And looking at Robert, with his careful observations and his growing sensitivity to human complexity, Thomas could see the future unfolding. Another generation of heralds, carrying this ancient work forward into times yet to come. The leather journal that the merchants had given Thomas years ago was now filled with his observations and his recorded proclamations. And Robert had begun his own journal, following the same practice, learning to understand his work by reflecting on it in writing. These journals would become a kind of archive, not just of what had been announced, but of how a community had come to understand itself through the careful words of those entrusted with carrying its voice. The spring of 1275 arrived with a gentleness that seemed to promise abundance. The apple trees bloomed with such profusion that the entire town seemed wrapped in the scent of their flowers, and the river that ran beyond the marketplace swelled with snowmelt, its voice a constant murmur beneath all other sounds. It was in this season of renewal that Thomas began to notice something he had not fully recognized before, that the work of a herald was not confined to the market square, but extended into every corner of the community's life. Robert, now well into his second year of apprenticeship, had taken to walking through the town in the early mornings before the day's work began, a practice Thomas recognized from his own early days. The young man would return with observations in his notebook about conversations he had overheard, situations he had observed, quiet moments that suggested potential proclamations. "There is a widow," Robert mentioned one morning over their shared tea, "who tends the garden beside the monastery. She goes there every day at dawn and works until midday. The monks say she has been doing this for 3 years, ever since her husband died. The garden that was wild has become orderly and beautiful again, but no one has formally acknowledged her work. Thomas felt a familiar sense of rightness at this observation. "What do you think should be done?" he asked. Robert set down his cup carefully. "I think she should be proclaimed. Not to embarrass her, she is quiet and would not wish that. But the community should know that her work has transformed something. That grief, which could have been only sorrow, has become creation." Thomas recognized in this response the full flowering of Robert's understanding. The young man was no longer asking for permission or guidance about whether something was worthy of proclamation. He was recognizing significance wherever it manifested and trusting his judgment about what the community needed to understand. "Go," Thomas said. "Consult with the widow. Speak with the monastery's master of gardens. Understand what has been created. Then bring me what you have learned, and we will craft an announcement together." Over the following days, Robert conducted his investigation with the same careful attention he had learned to bring to all aspects of the work. He discovered that the widow's name was Margaret, a name that seemed to carry resonance with the quiet strength of the work she had done. She had been married to a stoneworker, and when he died, she had felt compelled to create something beautiful as a way of honoring his memory and transforming her grief. The monastery's garden, which had been allowed to grow wild during years of neglect, had been systematized and planted by Margaret's hands. She had worked with the monastery's herbalist to establish sections for medicinal plants, with the cook to create a vegetable garden that would sustain the community, and with the gardener to restore ornamental plantings that provided beauty alongside utility. When Thomas and Robert met to discuss the proclamation, Thomas asked his apprentice to articulate what he believed the announcement should accomplish. "It should acknowledge that grief can become creation," Robert said carefully. "It should make clear that Margaret's work was not simply beautifying a space, but transforming her own sorrow into something that serves the whole community. And it should invite the people of the town to see her in a new way, not just as a widow, but as an artist and a healer." Thomas listened without interrupting, recognizing in Robert's words the full integration of everything he had been taught. The young man understood that proclamations were not simply about conveying information, but about helping communities recognize and honor the spiritual significance of ordinary work. The announcement that emerged from their collaboration spoke of Margaret, 37 years old, with work-reddened hands and determined eyes, as someone who had taken her deepest sorrow and transformed it into something that now fed and healed and beautified the entire community. It described the garden in terms that made clear it was not merely a collection of plants, but a living testament to the human capacity to create meaning even in the midst of loss. When the proclamation was made in the market square on an early spring morning, with Margaret present, somewhat reluctant but present nonetheless, something shifted in how the community understood her. Women who had known her primarily as the widow who worked in the monastery garden began to see her instead as an artist whose medium was earth and growing things. The monks, who had benefited from her work daily, recognized formally what they had come to understand through experience, that she was a kind of healer. After the proclamation, several people approached Margaret with requests. A woman whose daughter had recently married asked if Margaret would design a small garden for the couple's new home. The monastery's master of scribes asked if she would consider creating a herb garden specifically for the production of manuscript inks. A wealthy merchant requested her consultation on beautifying the grounds around his house. That evening, Robert sat in the Herald's rooms with a kind of quiet satisfaction that Thomas had not seen in him before. "The work we do," Robert said slowly, "is not just about speaking words. It is about helping people understand themselves and each other." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "That is the deepest truth of it. When you can help someone recognize the significance of their own work, you give them something that transforms how they understand their own life. Edmund taught me this, and now I am teaching it to you. And someday, when you take on an apprentice of your own, you will teach it to someone else." As spring deepened into early summer, the town seemed to settle into a rhythm of growth and expansion. The market grew busier as merchants from surrounding regions came to trade. The guilds began their summer projects, the stonemasons resuming work on the church's bell tower, the carpenters undertaking repairs to the bridge, the weavers preparing for the great shearing and dyeing season. And through all of this activity, the Herald's voice continued to carry across the market square, helping the community understand itself. Thomas found himself increasingly comfortable in the role that had become his own. He no longer thought about how Edmund would have handled a particular situation. Instead, he trusted his own judgment, his own understanding that had been built through years of careful attention. But he was also aware that his understanding was deepening in ways that went beyond technique. He had begun to notice patterns in how communities worked, in how people understood themselves, in what kinds of proclamations seemed to help communities move through transitions and changes with grace and wisdom. In July, as the heat of summer settled over the town and people moved more slowly in the thick air, a merchant came with a request that troubled him. His son, the merchant explained, had fallen in love with a girl whose father was of lower social standing. The merchant wished to prevent the union, fearing that his son's status and prospects would be damaged by such a marriage. "I want you to make a proclamation," the merchant said, "announcing my son's betrothal to the daughter of a more suitable family. If the town hears this announced officially, perhaps the boy will accept it as inevitable and abandon his infatuation with the unsuitable girl." Thomas listened without interrupting, understanding that the merchant's anxiety about his son's future was genuine, even though his proposed solution was deeply problematic. "I cannot make that proclamation," Thomas said finally. "Not because I do not understand your concern for your son, but because such a proclamation would be false. If your son is truly infatuated with another girl, announcing a different betrothal will not change his heart. It will only create conflict and deception within your family." The merchant's face flushed with anger. "I am paying for a service," he said coldly. "I am commissioning an announcement. Whether you personally approve of the message is irrelevant." Thomas felt Robert tense beside him, but the young apprentice remained quiet, allowing Thomas to navigate this difficult moment. The older herald took a breath and spoke with the careful clarity that Edmund had taught him to use when delivering difficult truths. "There is something you should understand about the herald's role," Thomas said. "We are not simply the voices of those who commission announcements. We are also the keepers of truth within the community. When we stand in the market square and speak, the entire town trusts that what we are saying is genuine. If we abuse that trust by making false proclamations, even if we are paid to do so, we corrupt the entire system of understanding that holds a community together." The merchant stood abruptly. "Then I will find another herald who understands the value of being paid." After he left, Robert turned to Thomas with a question in his eyes. Thomas gestured for the young man to sit, and they talked through what had happened. "That was difficult," Robert said. "Did we make the right choice?" "I believe so," Thomas replied. "Though the consequences will be complex. The merchant will likely be angry. He may influence others against us. But consider what would have happened if we had made the false proclamation. We would have damaged something essential, the trust that allows communities to understand themselves through the herald's voice." Thomas paused, gathering his thoughts. "Edmund taught me that the work of a herald is a sacred trust. We carry not just the words people ask us to carry, but something deeper, the community's faith that what we speak is true. If we betray that faith for payment or favor, we betray everything the work is meant to accomplish." Over the following weeks, Thomas watched to see if there would be repercussions from his refusal to make the false proclamation. But instead of anger spreading, something unexpected happened. Word of the merchant's attempt and Thomas's refusal seemed to enhance rather than diminish the town's trust in the herald's work. Several people approached Thomas to express their appreciation that he would not abuse his position, even when offered payment. And curiously, the merchant's son, whether because he learned of his father's attempt to prevent his union or for reasons of his own, did eventually marry the girl he loved. The betrothal was announced by Thomas in late summer, and the proclamation he crafted honored both the young couple's choice and the family's eventual acceptance of it. The merchant, present in the market square for the proclamation, seemed to accept the situation with a kind of resigned grace. That autumn, as the year began its turn toward winter again, Thomas realized that he had now been the town's herald for more than a year without Edmund's guidance. The older man's chair still sat in the corner of the rooms, a reminder of his presence, but Thomas no longer felt the need to consult it or to imagine Edmund's judgment about his choices. Robert, now 18 years old with his serious bearing and his ever-growing notebook of observations, was becoming not simply an apprentice learning a craft, but a true colleague in the work. Thomas found himself increasingly consulting with Robert about difficult announcements, not because the young man needed instruction, but because his observations often revealed dimensions of a situation that Thomas's own understanding had missed. One evening in early autumn, as the light was beginning to shift toward the gold and amber tones that preceded winter, Thomas made a decision. He asked Robert to sit with him by the window that overlooked the market square. "I want to teach you something that cannot be written down or fully articulated," Thomas said. "Something that I learned from Edmund through observation rather than instruction. It is about the relationship between the herald and the community, about how a true herald becomes, over time, something like a mirror that helps people see themselves. Robert settled into his chair, his attention complete, ready to listen. "When I was young," Thomas began, "I thought the work of a herald was about having a clear voice and understanding language and being able to carry words accurately across a space. But over time, I have come to understand that the deepest work is about presence. It is about being present to the community in such a way that people come to trust your understanding of what matters." Thomas paused, looking out at the market square where, even in the gathering darkness, he could see the shapes of buildings and the outline of the fountain. Edmund was the herald for 30 years. By the time I arrived as an apprentice, he had become woven into the fabric of the community so thoroughly that people trusted not just his words, but his judgment about which things were worth announcing. That trust took decades to build, but it was the foundation of his true power. Not the power to make people listen, but the earned authority that came from years of careful, honest work. "How do I build such trust?" Robert asked. "By doing what we have been doing," Thomas replied. "By listening carefully to what people truly need to say. By refusing to make false proclamations even when offered payment. By understanding that every announcement we make is a kind of sacred trust. By showing up day after day, year after year, doing the work with honesty and care." As autumn deepened and the year moved toward its close, Thomas found himself in a state of profound peace. The work that had seemed so uncertain and difficult when he first began had become natural, woven into his understanding of how to move through the world. And watching Robert develop his own skills and understanding, Thomas could see the future unfolding, generations of heralds continuing this ancient work, helping communities recognize the significance of their own lives. The leather journal that the merchants had given Thomas years ago was nearly full now, filled with records of proclamations made and observations about the work. He had begun a second journal, and Robert had filled nearly 3 notebooks with his own observations and practice proclamations. These journals would become a kind of legacy, not just records of what had been announced, but evidence of how communities understand themselves through the careful attention of those entrusted with carrying their voice. They would be preserved in the herald's rooms, and someday, when Thomas was old like Edmund, he would sit in that corner chair and watch a new apprentice come to understand the work, and he would know that the chain of understanding continued unbroken. Winter came early that year, arriving in late October with an unexpected snowfall that blanketed the town in white and silenced the market square in a way that even the deepest snows of January could not quite match. The sudden transition from autumn's richness to winter's stillness seemed to settle something in Thomas's understanding, a recognition that time itself was a kind of proclamation, that seasons turned and turned again, that all things moved through cycles of growth and rest and renewal. Robert, now approaching his 3rd year of apprenticeship, had developed a habit of rising before dawn to watch the town wake. Thomas would sometimes find him at the window in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for the first light to begin its gradual illumination of the market square below. There was something almost meditative about these early mornings, a time when the herald's rooms existed in a kind of suspended state between night and day, between the dream time and the waking world. It was during one of these early mornings in November, when the snow lay thick on the cobblestones and the world seemed newly created, that Robert asked Thomas a question that revealed how deeply his understanding had evolved. "Master," Robert said, using the formal address that he had begun to employ as his role shifted from pure apprentice toward colleague. "When you stand in the market square and make a proclamation, what are you aware of in those moments?" Thomas considered the question seriously, understanding that Robert was asking not for a simple answer, but for insight into the actual experience of the work. He took his time before responding. "I am aware of many things simultaneously," Thomas said finally. "I am aware of the community gathered to listen. I am aware of the particular person who commissioned the announcement, often standing somewhere in the square, waiting to hear their truth carried on my voice. I am aware of the words themselves, and the way they need to move through the air with clarity and intention. But beneath all of that, I am aware of something else, a kind of responsibility to the moment itself, to ensure that what is being announced carries not just information, but recognition of significance." Robert nodded slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the pale light coming through the window. "I felt that yesterday," he said, "when I proclaimed the news about the Master Mason's retirement. I was aware of all the things you described, but there was something else too, a kind of gravity to the moment, as though the words I was speaking were creating something that had not existed before." "Yes," Thomas said with quiet satisfaction. "You are beginning to understand that proclamations do not simply convey pre-existing information. In some mysterious way, they create reality. When you stand in the market square and announce that someone has earned a position of respect, you are not merely reporting on something that was true in isolation. You are making it true in a new way, true in the community's understanding, true in the memory and recognition of all those who hear it." The early winter deepened, and with it came a rhythm that Thomas had come to expect but still found moving each year. The announcements became fewer in number as the cold kept people closer to their homes and their hearths. The market square, when people gathered there, took on a different character. People moved more quickly, bundled against the cold, conducting their business with efficient urgency rather than the leisurely pace of warmer seasons. But even in this season of contraction, there were proclamations to be made. A midwife retiring after 40 years of delivering bobbies. A young couple announcing their betrothal in the face of family opposition. A situation that required Thomas to craft language that honored both their love and the courage such a choice required. A merchant announcing the loss of a shipment in a storm. A proclamation that needed to help the community understand both the practical implications and the merchant's own grief at his lost investment. Each proclamation received the same careful attention that Thomas and Robert brought to every announcement. The work had become so integrated into their understanding of how to move through the world that it no longer felt like effort. It felt instead like breathing, a natural expression of how they understood their role in the community. In December, as the shortest day of the year approached and the darkness seemed to deepen even at midday, Thomas received a visitor who brought unexpected news. A woman climbed the narrow stairs to the Herald's rooms, a woman of perhaps 40 years, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect. Her clothing suggested considerable wealth, and her manner suggested she was not accustomed to uncertainty about her purpose. "I am Margaret of the monastery garden," she introduced herself, "though I suspect you know of me through your proclamation some months ago." Thomas rose to greet her, gesturing for her to sit. He recognized her immediately, the widow whose work with the garden had been proclaimed in the spring, the woman whose grief had been transformed into creation. "I am honored," Thomas said. "Your work is remarkable." Margaret nodded, accepting this recognition without false modesty. "I came to commission a proclamation," she said, "but it is of an unusual nature. I am no longer simply the widow tending the monastery's garden. I have been offered a position. The monasteries throughout the region have heard of my work, and they have asked if I would travel among them, teaching their communities how to establish and maintain gardens that serve both practical and spiritual purposes." Thomas understood immediately what was being asked. This was not simply an announcement of a new position, but a kind of farewell. Margaret would be leaving the town, at least for extended periods. The community needed to understand that her departure was not loss but continuation, that her work would expand beyond the single garden she had created. "This is significant," Thomas said. "It will require a careful proclamation." "Yes," Margaret agreed, "and I wanted to request that it be made by the younger Herald, your apprentice. I have watched him work over these past months, and I believe he will understand what needs to be said." Thomas felt something settle in him at this recognition. Robert had earned the trust of the community to a degree that Thomas had not fully acknowledged until this moment. The young man was no longer simply an apprentice learning to make proclamations. He had become someone whose voice the community recognized and valued. "Robert," Thomas called, and the young apprentice appeared from the room where he had been organizing materials. "We have a commission for you. Margaret of the monastery garden has asked specifically for you to craft her proclamation." Robert's eyes widened slightly with surprise, but he quickly composed himself and gestured for Margaret to sit and tell her story. Thomas withdrew to a respectful distance, allowing the consultation to proceed between Robert and the woman commissioning the announcement. He could hear the careful questions Robert asked, not about the technical details of Margaret's new work, but about what it meant to her to be leaving the community, about how she understood the expansion of her work, about what she hoped the town would understand about her continued connection even as she traveled to other places. Over the following days, Thomas observed as Robert worked on the proclamation. The young man was more careful than usual, more deliberate. He wrote multiple drafts, consulted with Thomas about particular phrasings, walked through the monastery garden himself to see the work that would be proclaimed. When Robert finally brought the finished proclamation to Thomas for review, the older herald read it with complete attention. The words Robert had crafted spoke of Margaret's journey from widow to gardener to teacher. It acknowledged both the community's loss in her expanded travels and their pride in her accomplishment. It made clear that her work would continue to be connected to this town, even as it expanded outward to serve other communities. The proclamation had a quality that Thomas recognized from his own best work. the sense that the words carried not just information, but a kind of emotional truth that honored the complexity of the moment. Margaret was leaving, yes, but she was leaving as someone recognized and celebrated, leaving to do work that the community understood as important and worthy. When Robert made the proclamation in the market square on a cold morning in mid-December, the gathered community listened with a quality of attention that suggested they understood the significance of what was being announced. Margaret stood in the square, and when the proclamation was finished, several people approached her. The monastery's master of gardens, women who had learned from her, merchants who had benefited from her work beautifying their properties. Thomas watched from a slight distance, and he felt a kind of completion settling into him. Robert had truly become a herald now. The apprentice was no longer learning the work. He had integrated it so thoroughly that his own voice and understanding shaped how the proclamations were crafted and delivered. That evening, Thomas and Robert sat together by the fire, and Thomas formally acknowledged what had happened. "You are ready," Thomas said simply, "not to work entirely independently. There will always be situations that benefit from consultation and discussion, but you are ready to carry the full weight of this work. You have earned the community's trust through years of careful attention and honest effort." Robert, 18 years old and approaching 19, sat quietly for a moment before responding. "I have been thinking," he said finally, "about what comes next. You took me in as an apprentice when I was uncertain about my path. Now I am coming to understand that someday I will need to do for someone else what you have done for me." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "That is how the work continues. Edmund taught me, I am teaching you, and someday you will teach someone else. The chain of understanding extends backward to generations we will never know and forward to generations we will not live to see. We are simply links in that chain, each one responsible for passing on the understanding to the next." As December deepened and the year began its final count toward completion, the market square grew quieter still. The deep cold kept people indoors, and the announcements became few, primarily notices about the market's winter schedule and occasional proclamations related to the monastery's religious calendar. It was during this quiet season that Thomas began to think about something that Edmund had never explicitly discussed with him, but that he had come to understand through observation. It was time to consider what his own eventual stepping back from the active work of Herald would look like. He was not old, only in his early 20s, but he had already held the position for long enough to understand that someday Robert would need to fully become the herald, and Thomas would need to transition into the role of observer and elder that Edmund had occupied. This understanding did not trouble him. Instead, it brought a sense of rightness, the knowledge that the work would continue, that Robert would carry it forward with his own gifts and understanding, that new apprentices would come in time to be trained by Robert. One afternoon in late December, when the light was already fading by mid-afternoon, and the cold seemed to have settled permanently into the bones of the world, Thomas brought a proposal to Robert. "Next year," Thomas said, "I think you should take the lead on all major proclamations. I will consult with you, and I will be present in the square, but your voice will be the primary one carrying the town's announcements. I will observe and support, but the work will be yours to carry." Robert looked up from the parchment he was preparing, surprise evident on his young face. "Are you stepping away?" he asked. "Not stepping away," Thomas clarified, "but moving into a different role. I will still work with you on complex announcements. I will still review what you have done. But the community needs to know that you are the Herald now, not the apprentice of the Herald. The transition needs to happen gradually so that people understand it as a natural continuation rather than a sudden change." Over the following days, Thomas and Robert discussed how this transition would work practically. They agreed that the most straightforward announcements would be Robert's to make independently. More complex proclamations would be discussed and crafted together, with Robert taking the lead. And if situations arose that required the deepest wisdom or the most careful navigation, both voices could be present, Thomas and Robert together in the market square, carrying the community's announcements. As the year drew toward its close and the winter solstice approached again, a year since Edmund's death, Thomas realized he found himself thinking about continuity and change, about how traditions survived not by remaining static, but by being actively carried forward by each generation into new contexts and new times. The work that Edmund had taught him was the same work that Thomas had learned to make his own. And now Robert was learning to make it his own, adding his own sensitivity and understanding to the tradition, shaping it subtly in ways that reflected his own gifts, while remaining true to the deeper purposes Edmund had taught Thomas to understand. On the winter solstice, as the darkest day of the year arrived, Thomas and Robert stood together in the market square as the weak sun began its descent toward the horizon. There were no proclamations scheduled for that day. The solstice itself was considered too significant to burden with ordinary announcements. Instead, Thomas had suggested they simply stand in the square and observe the turning of the year. They stood silently, watching the light begin to fail, watching people hurry through their business before the darkness deepened, watching the familiar landscape of the market square gradually disappear into shadow. "The day will begin to grow longer again tomorrow," Robert said softly. "Yes," Thomas replied, "as it always does. The year turns and we turn with it. We pass on what we have learned and others will pass on what they learn. The work continues, even when individual workers pass away or move into different roles." As darkness settled completely and the first stars began to emerge in the winter sky, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace. The work would continue. Robert would carry it forward, and Thomas would be there to support and guide, no longer the primary voice but still present, still invested, still understanding the sacred trust that the community had placed in those who spoke its truths in the market square. The new year arrived quietly, as New Year's do, with no fanfare beyond the calendar's turning. But Thomas had arranged for something to mark the transition he and Robert had discussed, a simple proclamation that would introduce the community to the shift in their herald's responsibilities. On the first market day of the new year, Thomas stood with Robert in the market square. The morning was bitterly cold, the ground frozen hard beneath the snow, the air so crisp it seemed to carry sound differently. Thomas's breath misted before him as he lifted his voice to carry across the listening ears gathered before them. "Hear now the proclamation of the market square," he began, using the traditional opening that he had spoken hundreds of times now. "The work of the Herald continues, as it has for generations beyond counting. But those of us who carry this work understand that it must be continually renewed, brought forward into new times by new voices, while maintaining the truth of what has always been essential." Thomas paused, feeling the weight of the moment. He could see people's faces turned toward him, their attention complete. Robert, now in his third year of apprenticeship, and having demonstrated the wisdom and care necessary for this work, will become the primary voice of the Herald for this community. "I will continue to be present, to consult on complex matters, to guide when guidance is needed. But the town's announcements will be carried primarily by Robert's voice. This is not an ending but a continuation. The work passes forward into capable hands." When he finished, there was a moment of silence, and then a few people began to clap, a gentle sound that echoed off the market hall's stone. Robert, standing slightly apart from Thomas, looked both terrified and honored by what had just been publicly acknowledged. Over the following weeks, the transition took shape gradually. Robert began making the majority of the daily announcements, while Thomas consulted on the complex matters that still came. The community adjusted to hearing Robert's younger voice in the market square, and Thomas observed with quiet satisfaction as people began to recognize his apprentice not as a helper, but as the primary herald. The first significant proclamation that Robert made independently was in late January, when a master craftsman requested an announcement about his retirement. The craftsman had spent 45 years making fine furniture, and his hands bore the marks of decades of careful work, calluses from holding tools, slight deformations from repetitive motion, a tremor that suggested age beginning to claim what years of strength had built. Robert consulted carefully with the old master, asking the questions that had become second nature to him through his training. What did this retirement mean? Was it an ending or a transition? What legacy did the craftsman hope to leave? What did he hope the community would understand about what he had created? When Robert made the proclamation, Thomas stood in the square but said nothing. The young herald's voice carried across the space with the kind of authority that came from genuine understanding. He spoke of the craftsman's 4 decades of work, of the furniture that now graced homes throughout the region, of the apprentices he had trained who would carry forward the standards he had established. But more than this, Robert's words made clear that the craftsman's retirement was not a diminishment, but a completion, the final brushstroke on a life's work that had been characterized by patience, by commitment to beauty and quality, by the quiet mastery that only comes through decades of dedicated practice. When the proclamation ended, the old craftsman stepped forward and embraced Robert, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge not just the words but the understanding that had gone into crafting them. Thomas, observing from a slight distance, felt a rightness settle in him. The work was passing forward. Robert was becoming what Thomas had become, what Edmund had been before him. As winter progressed and the days began their slow lengthening, Robert grew increasingly confident in his role. He began to develop small practices that were uniquely his own. He would often walk through the town before crafting a proclamation, visiting the location relevant to an announcement, and understanding the physical space where the proclaimed event would take place. He also began to keep his own version of the leather journal, recording not just the proclamations he made, but his observations about how they were received, what resonated with the community, what questions people asked afterward. He showed these journals to Thomas occasionally, and Thomas could see in them the development of the kind of deep understanding that could only come through years of careful attention. In March, when the first green shoots were pushing through the winter's accumulated snow, a situation arose that required both Thomas and Robert working together. A conflict had developed between two guild masters, the master of the stoneworkers and the master of the carpenters, about who had responsibility for maintaining the bridge that connected the town to the agricultural lands beyond. The dispute had become public enough that people were beginning to take sides, and Thomas recognized the danger that such divisions could create within a community. The two masters needed to make a proclamation together that would resolve the conflict in a way that preserved both their honor and their ability to work cooperatively in the future. This was exactly the kind of complex situation that Thomas had learned to navigate through years of careful work. But this time, he decided to let Robert take the lead on the consultation, while Thomas observed and offered guidance only when necessary. Robert met with the two masters separately, understanding their positions, their fears, their pride. Then he asked them both to come together to discuss how they wanted the community to understand the resolution of their dispute. It was delicate work. The masters were both defensive, both worried about losing face, both concerned about how the announcement might be perceived. But Robert, with a sensitivity that Thomas recognized as genuine empathy rather than calculated technique, helped them understand that the proclamation did not need to declare one master right and the other wrong. Instead, it could acknowledge that maintaining a bridge that served both town and countryside required the skills of both stoneworkers and carpenters, working in cooperation. When the proclamation was finally made, with both guild masters standing together in the market square, it spoke of the bridge as a shared responsibility that required both the structural knowledge of stone workers and the timber work of carpenters. It described the resolve of both masters to work together in maintaining the community's vital connection to the surrounding countryside. The effect was remarkable. Within days, the two masters had established a formal arrangement for joint maintenance of the bridge. Moreover, the people of the town seemed to understand that the resolution came not from external force, but from the masters' own recognition that cooperation served everyone better than conflict. After the proclamation was finished and the square had emptied, Thomas pulled Robert aside. "That was exemplary work," Thomas said. "You did not simply resolve a dispute. You helped the community understand that cooperation and shared responsibility can be more honored than winning an argument. That is the deepest work a herald can do." Robert, still slightly trembling from the intensity of the moment, accepted the praise with quiet satisfaction. I was uncertain whether they would agree to such a proclamation, he admitted. I was worried that their pride would prevent them from standing together. Yes, Thomas said. That uncertainty is important to carry. It prevents you from becoming careless or overconfident. The moment you begin to assume you know how something will go is the moment you stop truly listening. As spring deepened and the market square began to bustle again with the activity of the warmer seasons, Thomas found himself spending more time simply observing. He would sit by the window in the Herald's rooms, watching the activity below, thinking about the announcements that would need to be made, considering which ones Robert should handle independently and which would benefit from consultation. The town seemed to have fully accepted Robert as the primary herald. When people came to commission announcements, they addressed their remarks to Robert, though they often acknowledged Thomas's presence with respect. The transition had happened so gradually and naturally that it seemed to the community less like a change and more like the inevitable unfolding of how things had always worked. One afternoon in late April, when the apple trees were in their full bloom again, and the scent of their flowers drifted across the entire town, a young man climbed the stairs to the Herald's rooms. He was perhaps 15 or 16 years old, with an uncertain bearing that Thomas recognized immediately. This was what Robert must have looked like when he first arrived, Thomas thought, nervous but drawn by some sense that this work might be his calling. "I am looking for the Herald," the young man said. "My father says I have a voice that carries well, and that I seem to notice things that others overlook. He thought I might ask about apprenticeship." Thomas felt something in his chest expand at these words. He and Robert exchanged a glance, and Thomas gestured for the young man to sit. "What is your name?" Robert asked, taking the lead as the primary herald now. "Daniel," the young man replied. "My father is a blacksmith, but I do not think I want to work with metal. I want to understand how words work, how they carry meaning." Thomas listened as Robert began to explain the nature of the herald's work, using the same careful language that Thomas had used when Robert first arrived. He watched as Robert asked Daniel questions about his observations, his understanding of the community, and his willingness to listen carefully to what people truly needed to say. And in that moment, Thomas understood fully that the chain of understanding had not been broken but continued. Edmund had taught Thomas, Thomas had taught Robert, and now Robert was beginning to teach Daniel. The tradition would continue, passing forward through generations, each one adding their own understanding while remaining true to the deepest purposes Edmund had taught Thomas to preserve. That evening, after Daniel had left and Robert had gone to his chamber to rest, Thomas sat alone in the herald's rooms. He stood and walked to the corner where Edmund's chair still sat, a quiet monument to the man who had guided him. Thomas ran his hand along the worn leather, feeling the texture of decades of use, thinking about the older herald's patient presence during his own years of learning. He thought about the transition that was underway, not sudden or dramatic, but gradual and natural. He was no longer the primary herald, though he still participated in the work. Soon, Robert would no longer be the apprentice and would take on the full responsibilities of teaching. And someday, Daniel would move from learning to guiding others, and the understanding would pass forward yet again, This was how traditions survived, not by remaining unchanged, but by being actively lived and renewed by each generation. Each herald brought his own gifts, his own sensitivity, his own way of understanding the work. But beneath these individual variations was the same core understanding that Edmund had taught Thomas, that the herald's voice served the community's need to understand itself, that every person's work and choices and transitions mattered, that the sacred duty of a herald was to help ordinary people recognize the significance of their ordinary lives. In late May, when spring had fully given way to early summer and the market square was filled with the activity of the warm season, Robert approached Thomas with a proposal. "I want to take Daniel on as an apprentice," Robert said, "formally, with your blessing, not as a replacement for the work you and I do together, but as the next step in the continuation of the tradition." Thomas felt a deep satisfaction at these words. "Yes," he said simply, "this is exactly as it should be. You are ready to teach, just as I was ready when I took on that responsibility. And Daniel will learn from you and from observing you and from the mistakes he will make and the corrections he will receive. He will become a herald in his own time, carrying the work forward into the future." As the summer progressed, the herald's rooms took on the character of a place where knowledge was actively being passed forward. Robert would work with Thomas on particularly complex proclamations, and simultaneously would be teaching Daniel the basic skills of the craft. The young apprentice would watch as Robert made announcements in the market square, would practice his lettering late into the evenings, would ask questions about the nature of the work, with the kind of earnest attention that suggested he understood he was being entrusted with something significant. Thomas found himself taking increasing satisfaction in observation. He would sit by the window and watch the market square, but his attention was often on Robert and Daniel rather than on the activity below. He was watching the transmission of understanding, the way Robert would pause before making a proclamation and compose himself, the way Daniel would take notes on how people's faces changed when they heard their situations honored in the herald's voice. By late summer, as the heat began to ease and the first signs of autumn appeared in subtle shifts of light and temperature, Thomas realized that he had moved fully into the role that Edmund had occupied when Thomas himself was learning. He was an observer and guide, present to the work, but no longer its primary carrier. He was available for consultation and wisdom, but the weight of daily responsibility had passed entirely to Robert. This transition, which he had anticipated with some uncertainty, brought instead a profound sense of rightness. He was still engaged in the work, still invested in its continuation, but he had been released from the burden of always having to be the primary voice. Robert carried that burden now, with Daniel learning to carry it in turn. One evening in early September, when the summer was definitely giving way to autumn, and the quality of the light had begun to shift toward the richness that preceded winter, Thomas invited Robert and Daniel to sit with him as the sun set over the market square. "I want to tell you both something," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through transitions and understood their significance. "The work we do is ancient. It reaches back beyond the memory of anyone living in this town, probably beyond the memory of this town itself. And it will continue forward into the future, long after all of us have passed away and become stories that others tell. Thomas paused, allowing his words to settle. Edmund taught me that a herald is not important because of any individual gift or talent. A herald is important because he carries something larger than himself. The community's need to understand itself. When you stand in the market square and make a proclamation, you are not speaking your own words. You are speaking the community's words, helping it recognize and honor what is significant about its own life. Robert listened with the quiet attention of someone who had already integrated this understanding. But Daniel, still new to the work, listened as though hearing a revelation. "There will be times," Thomas continued, "when you doubt whether the work matters, when you wonder if anyone cares about the announcements you make, when you feel the weight of responsibility and wish you could simply be released from it. In those moments, remember that the work has continued through generations precisely because ordinary people, doing this work carefully and honestly, have helped their communities understand themselves. That understanding is what holds communities together, what gives people the sense that their lives matter." Thomas stood and moved to the window, gesturing for them to join him. From this vantage point, they could see the entire market square, the fountain at its center, the buildings surrounding it, the streets leading away into the town beyond. In the fading light, it was all visible and clear and beautiful in its simplicity. "This is what we serve," Thomas said. "Not power or glory or personal achievement. We serve this. The community's need to understand itself, to recognize the significance of ordinary work and ordinary lives, to see that every person's choices and transitions matter. That is sacred work, and it is worthy of all the care and attention we can bring to it." The autumn light was fading as Thomas stood with Robert and Daniel at the window, the three heralds of different generations watching the market square settle into the evening. The fountain cast long shadows, and the buildings surrounding the square seemed to embrace the space like a community gathered to listen to some final, perfect proclamation. Thomas turned from the window and moved toward Edmund's chair, the one that had sat in the corner all these years, a quiet reminder of the man who had taught him everything that mattered. He ran his hand along its worn surface one final time, then gestured for Robert to sit. "This is yours now," Thomas said simply. "Not because you need to sit in it while you work, but because you should know it is here, waiting. When you are old like Edmund was, or like I will be someday, you may find yourself sitting in this chair, watching a younger herald go about the work. You will understand then why Edmund sat here so contentedly, simply observing, knowing that the work continued in capable hands." Robert sat in the chair carefully, as though it was a sacred object, which, in a sense, it was. The leather creaked beneath his weight, and there was something about the way he settled into it that suggested he understood its significance. Daniel watched from the other side of the room, his young face serious with the weight of understanding that he too would someday sit in such a chair, and would someday watch apprentices of his own carry the work forward. Thomas moved to his work table and gathered his leather journal, the one the merchants had given him years ago, the one that now contained the record of hundreds of proclamations, of the work that had shaped his understanding and his life. He handed it to Robert. "Keep this with the other journals," Thomas said. "They are a record not just of what was announced, but of how a community comes to understand itself. Someday, when someone asks where the Herald's tradition comes from, you can show them these journals and say, 'Here is where it lives, in the careful attention of ordinary people doing sacred work.'" The evening had now deepened fully into night, and the market square below had disappeared into darkness. Only the faintest outline of the fountain was visible, and the windows of nearby buildings glowed with candlelight. Families gathered around their hearths, the intimate light of evening life being lived in 1,000 small ways throughout the town. "There is one more thing I want you to understand," Thomas said to both Robert and Daniel, his voice carrying the particular quality it took on when he was about to speak something essential. "The hardest part of this work is not the skill of making proclamations or the ability to carry your voice across a market square. The hardest part is maintaining the integrity of the work when you are tired, when you are tempted to make a false proclamation for payment, when you doubt whether anyone truly cares about what you say." Thomas paused, his eyes distant with memory. "Edmund taught me this through examples rather than words. He never told me to refuse a false proclamation, but I watched him maintain the integrity of the work year after year, and I understood that it was the foundation of everything. When people trust that a herald speaks only truth, when they understand that the herald serves the community's need to understand itself rather than any individual's desire for power or influence, only then does the work matter." Robert, sitting in Edmund's chair, nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "I have felt the weight of that responsibility in every proclamation I have made since taking on the role." "Good," Thomas said. "That weight is appropriate. It means you understand what you carry." Thomas moved then to prepare to leave the Herald's rooms for the evening. He would not be sleeping here tonight. The chamber that had been his alone since Edmund died would soon become Robert's, as Robert's would become Daniel's in time. The succession was complete, the transition full and acknowledged. At the door, Thomas turned back for a final moment. "Tomorrow the work continues," he said. "There will be announcements to make, people who need the Herald's voice to help them understand what they are experiencing. Robert, you will carry that voice. Daniel, you will learn by watching and listening. And I will be here, available for consultation, present to the work, but released from the burden of being the primary voice." Thomas looked at them both. Robert at 20 years old, settling into the full weight of the Herald's responsibility, and Daniel at 15, standing at the threshold of understanding something that would shape the rest of his life. "You are both ready for what lies ahead," Thomas said. "Not because you know everything, you never will, and that is good, but because you understand that the work matters, and you are willing to bring honest attention to it. That is all that has ever been required of a herald." He stepped through the doorway and descended the narrow stairs into the night. The market square was empty now, the cobblestones dark and still beneath the winter sky. Thomas paused in the square for a moment, looking up at the windows of the herald's rooms, where candlelight suggested that Robert and Daniel were still there, perhaps discussing the work, perhaps simply sitting in the presence of something that had begun to make sense to them. The monastery bells began to ring for evening prayer, the same bells that rang every day, that had rung for generations, that would continue ringing long after Thomas himself had passed away. The sound carried across the empty square, across the rooftops of the sleeping town, out into the countryside beyond, a voice that had no need for proclamation because it simply was, year after year, season after season, the rhythm of community life continuing its ancient pattern. Thomas wrapped his cloak more tightly around himself and began to walk through the town. He moved slowly, without purpose or destination, simply allowing his feet to carry him through the familiar streets. He passed the baker's shop, long closed now, but still fragrant with the memory of bread. He passed the monastery's gates, where monks were gathering for the evening office. He passed the homes of people he had known for years, people whose joys and sorrows he had helped to proclaim, people whose lives had been honored in the Herald's voice. And as he walked, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion settling into him. The work would continue. Robert had the understanding and the capacity to carry it forward with wisdom and care. Daniel would learn and grow into the role, would eventually teach someone else, and the chain of understanding would remain unbroken. Edmund was gone, but his presence lived on in the way Thomas understood the work. Thomas himself would gradually withdraw from the active role, but his presence would continue to shape the Herald's rooms, to offer guidance when needed, to witness the continuation of the tradition. This was how things survived, not through any individual's permanence, but through the careful transmission of understanding from one generation to the next. The heralds would change, but the work would remain. The town would transform over time, but the fundamental need for a voice to help the community recognize the significance of its own life would endure. Thomas found himself, as evening deepened toward night, standing at the edge of the marketplace beside the fountain. The water was still, reflecting the stars that had begun to emerge in the darkening sky. He stood there for a long time, simply present to the space where he had made hundreds of proclamations, where he had learned to understand the sacred work of carrying a community's voice. Tomorrow he will return to the Herald's rooms. There would be work to do, consultations with Robert about complex situations, observations about how proclamations had been received, the slow transfer of responsibility that would continue over months and years. But tonight, standing in the empty square beneath the emerging stars, Thomas allowed himself to simply rest in the knowledge that the work was in capable hands, that the tradition would continue, that he had fulfilled the responsibility Edmund had entrusted to him. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant hearths. Somewhere in the town, a dog barked. In the monastery, the monks were singing, their voices rising in the evening office, a sound that had carried across this same ground for generations beyond counting. Thomas closed his eyes and listened to the town's quiet voice. The bells, the wind, the distant singing, the subtle sounds of a community at rest. And in that listening, he heard something that contained all the proclamations he had ever made, all the words Edmund had taught him, all the understanding that Robert was now beginning to carry forward. The town would continue. The market square would fill again with people and activity. Announcements would be made, stories would be told, ordinary lives would be recognized as significant. The Herald's voice would continue to carry across the marketplace, helping the community understand itself, giving shape and meaning to the transitions and accomplishments and sorrows that were the fabric of human life. And that, Thomas understood with a clarity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than thought, was enough. That was everything. That was the whole purpose of a life dedicated to carrying the truth across an open space, to helping ordinary people understand that their lives mattered. The stars grew brighter as the night deepened, and Thomas, the herald of the market square, stood beneath them in peaceful completion, knowing that the work he had received from Edmund and given to Robert would continue long after he had passed away, shaping the community's understanding of itself through generations yet to come.